Representative Bovee.
Here.
Representative Brown.
Here.
Representative Flitner.
Excuse.
Representative Freeman.
Here.
Representative Kinner.
Here.
Representative Paxton.
Here.
Representative Pieperminen.
Here.
Representative Simpson.
Here.
Co-Chairman Northrup.
Here.
Chairman Coe.
Here. With that, the first thing on our agenda is consideration of an ECA. Matt, do you have any input before we proceed? And I appreciate you emailing out this morning, I think you said this morning, a breakdown of what we covered yesterday.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, thank you, and members of the committee. Yesterday, you had me run a scenario that would provide the annual change from the most recent year for the professional, non-professional staff, and then the past 2 years in annual changes on a cumulative basis for the non-personal items, which are utilities and supplies and materials. I will read off what the ECAs would be proposed to be. For professional staff, it would be 1.415%. Non-professional staff would be 1.536%. Utilities would be a 10.902%, and supplies would be 3.336%. If projected on fiscal year 20 estimates, currently would be an increase of approximately 26.6 million for next year.
Okay, we're getting a little feedback.
Is there a microphone on it? Up that one.
Okay, give me a test. Somebody speak.
Test.
1, 2.
Test.
Okay, is that good?
That's better.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, with that explanation, everybody received the email this morning, and of course, Matt just went through everything. Ray, what's your pleasure?
Mr. Chairman.
And we just, and we can do this after the vote or before the vote, just on a clarification on how to present this to the Joint Appropriations Committee. You know, if you do forward an increase of $26.6 million, and I, from a drafting standpoint, I'll let Ted explain this, but you know, we can provide just a single letter, or you can provide draft legislation that would do this. So Ted can explain kind of the reasoning behind that.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, so as Matt mentioned, there's the option just to conceptually recommend to JAC an ECA. You can just, you know, provide them the percentage increases. That would be easy enough to turn into a budget footnote. That's the way that ECAs have been done in the past. Another method would be a standalone piece of legislation that would go into session law from 2011, 2012,
17 and 18.
2017 and 2018, and actually amend component prices. So those session laws contain component prices. So for example, the model teacher salary is within those session laws, and you'd actually go in and we could change the dollar figure for those. We could adjust them up by the ECA. The advantage of that is that, you know, perhaps it's a bit more transparent. You know, perhaps if that legislation went through the legislature, we would, you know, more clearly see what the model numbers are. So the committee can choose between those two options if it proceeds with an ECA recommendation, just kind of the conceptual recommendation, or a standalone piece of legislation to present to the Joint Appropriations Committee.
I was trying to remember how we did it last time. For some reason, my recollection is that we just sent a letter to JAC telling them, you know, how we break it down rather than do legislation.
Yeah.
At least that's my recollection.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, that's the traditional path forward. Just from as Ted hit on it, from a transparency piece, a separate piece of legislation would align attachment, what we call attachment A, as codified in the definitions of Chapter 13 of Title 21. It would align those prices with what's actually in the funding model. So it just provides a little bit more transparency with a letter on the recommendation to Joint Appropriations. Joint Appropriations can do what they want with that. but it just gives them an avenue to either sponsor that piece of legislation, or they can put a budget footnote as well. But we would most certainly put a cover letter explaining the rationale of what those ECAs do and provide a breakdown of that increase for the Joint Appropriations Committee as well.
Okay. Senator Roberts.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I move that we forward a recommendation and accompanying legislation showing modifications to the component models to the Joint Appropriations Committee, reflecting increases in ECAs for professional staff of 1.415%, non-professional staff of 1.536%, utilities of 10.902%, and supplies of 3.336%, totaling approximately $26.6 million, while providing flexibility to our staff to amend these ECA adjustments based on final data from the U.S. Bureau of Labor and Statistics once that data is finalized.
That's the motion, seconded by Senator Pappas. So this will be Dear Bob and Bruce, Love Hank and David letter.
We get to present it.
Any discussion on the motion? Any discussion? Are you ready for the question on the motion? I think we need to vote. I think we need a roll call vote on this. So, Ted, you want to take roll?
Sure, Mr. Chairman. Senator Ellis.
No.
Senator Pappas.
Aye.
Senator Rosas.
Aye.
Senator Wasserberger is excused. Representative Bovee.
Aye.
Representative Brown.
Aye.
Representative Flitner is excused. Representative Freeman.
Aye.
Representative Kinner.
Aye.
Representative Paxton.
Aye.
Representative Peeperinen.
Aye.
Representative Simpson.
No.
Co-Chairman Northrup.
Aye.
Chairman Coe.
No.
All right.
Okay, that passes. We'll proceed to the next part of our agenda. Dr. Sandy Caldwell, if you'd like to come up, welcome. Community College Commission, the new sheriff in town, so to speak, and please proceed. Welcome. Nice to have you back in Wyoming.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chairs, legislators. I want to personally thank you for allowing me to be here with you today. I also wanted to thank the LSO staff, very helpful in helping me to prepare for this presentation today and be here with you. So their guidance was very appreciated, so thank you very much. It is great to be back in Wyoming. It's a long 5 years of my life to be out of Wyoming. Very happy to be back. For those of you that don't know, I am what you would call the new Jim Rose. A little shorter and taller shoes, but certainly excited to be here. I will tell you, I've been through kind of the gamut of community colleges. I was a community college student. I was a faculty member, taught mathematics, moved into administration, and just prior to this position, as the college president. So very happy to be serving our great state. I love Wyoming. I will tell you, my own children are products of the educational system here. Both my sons graduated from Rock Springs High School, go Tigers, and one from Western Wyoming Community College and one from Casper College right here. And then one of my sons from University of Wyoming. So this is very, very important to me, as this is what raised my own children. I will tell you that from a very personal experience, community colleges are very deep in my heart and have a difference that they can make in communities and in people in their lives. I myself was I will tell you, I was a homeless, independent miner in rural Oklahoma. In the Choctaw Nation, I avoided the tribal foster system and was able to be declared an independent minor, and it was through a community college that I was able to really make a difference in my life. Was able to graduate with my bachelor's, my master's, and ultimately to receive my doctoral degree in higher education. So this, to me, is a part of my work in support of the lives that I know we impact. Just a few things that I wanted to share. The community colleges have about 30,000 students across our state. About 15,000 non-credit students. People may not be aware of that. We've got 3,300, almost 3,400 credentials that were earned in the last year. 815 of those students transferred on to University of Wyoming, and I'm very proud to say that 75% of the graduating class from May of 2018 for the University of Wyoming were community college transfer students. Make a big impact in the state, and it shows that our pipeline on the items that I wanted to talk about today, and that will have us move into the next section. If that is
Yeah, that's perfect. So any questions before we go to the second phase of our agenda? Okay, please proceed.
Well, we have several items that I wanted to share with you that we're working on in the commission across the state. I did put in here what is in my first year plan. I'm working through that document very closely and really spending a lot of time with Erin and talking about things within our state, meeting with the president. I will tell you, educational attainment is a very high priority. It's actually been a part of the statewide strategic plan for 4 years. Now that we have the executive orders with the actual metric assigned to it, it's a very big focus, and we do that across the community colleges and the University of Wyoming. And now, of course, is a large focus. There's 25 of that document literally discusses the community colleges and how impactful that is. HEA 47, which is the common transcript. This is a very big focus of work that we're doing right now. I will be very frank with you. That is a component that we see is going to help us meet the attainment goal. This is something that we see going to the school to get us to this point. Safety and security, that is on the agenda with both Erin and myself. This is something that is paramount. Our colleges, I will tell you, are very safe. But there is a lot of work and support that our colleges need to be able to move forward with some information on that.
Senator Robbins.
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The common transcript, this is something that we've been talking about for a long time. I think we're all very interested in it. It's something that we struggle with also in high school and our high schools throughout the state. I'm just sort of curious what is actually being developed along those lines in terms of a product, and could it be something that our high schools could also have access to, where if we're building something which is a common model, and then we offer that opportunity to our high schools into a robust model, maybe that's something that they can use to build some commonality for also. So could you comment on that?
Mr. Chairman. Yes, Senator Roberts. Yes, I'll just move right into the HEA 47 component here and kind of give you an overview of what's occurring right now. To answer that question very specifically on that component, the answer is yes, our colleges are working very closely already with each of the K-12s that are in their service areas. But we are working on very specific components that's going to make these elements much easier and smoother. So let me go through what's been happening right now with the work group. Dr. Nichols and I, president of the University of Wyoming, moved very quickly on putting together a work group. We have members of that work group here today as representatives of the community colleges, the commission, as well as the University of Wyoming. We put together what is a 5-part plan, actually a 7-part plan, just to be clear about that. That work group is going into this work. The first item on there really speaks to what you're talking about, and that is the MOU for all 10 parties, which would be the community colleges, Department of Ed, the University of Wyoming, and continuing through the Community College Commission. I'm pleased to say that that actually is ready to go. Andy Corbin, who has been really working on it, he's one of the staff members at the Community College Commission, has been working across all of those entities to make sure we're ready to go. And he let me know last night that document, which is going to use that ability for us to have all of our data across all of our entities, work through and shared, is ready to go. So it is going into contracting. We will be imminent in signing that. And this is very, very critical part so that the rest of these components can really work. That does create where we really are trying to get to, which is statewide longitudinal education data system and having the capacity around that. And that's why I said that person's religion part, because that is a massive endeavor, but a critical one for the state. I think we're well aware of that component. Along with that is the common course membrane system and articulation across the colleges and to the University of Wyoming. We've got 128 programs that are currently articulated. More than we usually have an articulation conference next Friday. This is one of the elements that we're talking about. There are three more components, and the last one's really two. That I want to mention is we want to have a transcript vendor that allows to do the transcripts. But before you can get to that point, you have a lot of work that needs to happen. In those next parts, I'm going to kind of talk about those. There's a course catalog solution. There is the curriculum process management, which has the actual programs in there. Then the ability for courses and programs to actually transfer, and then for that transcript to be able to move electronically. So that there's a lot of parts in that this work group is really working on how to actually make all those parts work. It's not one single thing. First, we have the ability in place to allow us to do that. Then we have to have the course catalog solution. Then there has to be those courses for each of the colleges moved into an actual curriculum management. And then each one of those being able to move into or across the colleges and to the university, and then for the transcript to be able to do. So it's a multi-part process that each one of those components are in motion. How that's actually going to come out, they're working on making sure that we have a report for you by the deadline. And we anticipate we're going to be able to make that happen. I do want to be clear that each one of those parts does have technology and people requirements behind them. That's where I was talking about the EDL for the SLED, so I watched educational data system. But that takes a lot of different person to manage that. I can tell you that across the colleges and with Andy Corbin's leadership on the data system, he's really done focus on that. The work that our colleges did to get us to this point, but to actually really manage that long term is going to take some work. We'll need the catalog solutions, whatever that looks like. And that doesn't necessarily be identical across the colleges, but having an ability to really manage that with a message, particularly something that is completely preference to them on ERP, which is the anti-resource, which is the illusion or solution, which is the common for data. And then the catalog conversion itself, the transcripting and course transfer. So each one of those are going to be components that are going to have some sort of ability to actually implement. And we will have a cost for them in the report to try to get some idea of what that is. I have some preliminary numbers. Again, Mr. Corbin got those to me yesterday for an estimate for the course. Do you want to know those, or would you like to wait for those on that? So I think that cost might be.
Sure, we'd like to hear it.
Okay.
Yeah, we like to.
What I don't have is what the staffing is going to cost. We're going to be working on that. And these are not absolute numbers. I'll be very, very clear about that.
In order for there to be the course management process across the 7 colleges and the universities that we're talking about, data those systems, about $635,000 at one time. But then there is a maintenance cost that goes along with that, so that the system works over time, the technology is updated. About $195,000 a year annual across all of the institutions and made through the Community College Commission. So what that's going to finally be once this work group really comes down to what a solid recommendation is going to be, what we do best is appropriate vendor or vendors that are going to be a part of this. I have a better number for you, and we do anticipate that will be number 4. Okay. I do want to mention that we this HE 47, which is a vehicle for health attainment. What we recognize now is we'll have the ability to do reverse transfer and ensure that a student that has earned the credentials for the degree is actually we know that once we have our review in place, we'll be ready to go now in this system. So we can make sure that the citizens of Wyoming who earned their credentials and degree get that. Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to be here and set up there with Caldwell. She's exactly what on with the work that this working group is doing, and I'll let you know that I think it, at least from my perspective, I'm not the technology person. It's really opened my eyes to how complicated this is, and that might be something that not everyone here is aware of. So I just wanted to let you know that a lot of hard work is going into this, and we're coming up with the best solutions that we can.
Okay, excellent, thank you. Any questions from the committee? Okay, please proceed. I guess we're going. Let's put it all together. We'll put it all together. Go ahead.
Well, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, your number 2 priority is safety and security. And during the management council, we requested to be part of that conversation. We think it's really important for you to really understand what that looks like for the community colleges. So that's why we're here today, is to provide information for you and to look at what we do. With me here today in the audience are some folks who are in that area, because I am not the person who can answer what happens on this college.
Anybody here okay back there? They need to talk closer to the microphone.
Will this help a little bit?
Yeah, that's better.
Okay, thank you. I do have Dr. Carla Leach with me. Carla is the president of Western Wyoming Community College, if she's here in the audience. And then I also have Chief Jason Vila and Lieutenant Chad Cuddy from Sheridan College, from Northern Wyoming Community College District. Over here to my left. So these folks can provide a little bit of insight on what's happening in their colleges, but maybe even some insight on what's happening across the colleges. And the purpose of some of the handouts that you have before you is to just inform you that this is a conversation that isn't just happening in Wyoming, of course. This is a nationwide conversation. The security of our campuses. Community college campuses are different from K-12. And of course, you know that we are dealing with not only adult learners who are of all ages, we also have an open campus environment, and many of our campuses, all of them here in Wyoming, have preschool or daycare on their properties. And of course, we can't forget the communities who are coming and going to our campuses. So it's not as much of a controlled environment as a K-12 school is. And so with that, there are lots of different issues that face the colleges. And that's not just what we see on the headlines these days with guns on campus or weapons on campus. It's other issues like sexual violence, how we take care of our mental resources, mental health resources for our students. And we have weather-related issues and communications in that respect. So it's a little bit bigger enchilada, if you will, when we're looking at the work that these folks do. So the information that you have in your packets, the handout that is from the Education Commission of the States, this is just a little snapshot of what that national conversation looks like. I'm not going to walk you through that necessarily. It's more information. But what I wanted to touch on today that will give you, I think, a little bit more of an idea of the lay of the land of the colleges is the survey that my association put out to the colleges. It's not a scientific survey, it's a way to give you a snapshot among the 7 colleges. And this does include the Gillette campus, because they're separate. So they are technically 8 campuses are listed on here, and that's because of their response to this. But without walking through the entire survey, I know you all have the opportunity to look at that pretty clearly. It can show you that the resources are very wide and different across the colleges. Of course, you know, the size differences and those sorts of things do matter, and their ability to provide resources. In no way am I saying that our colleges are unsafe. As Dr. Caldwell mentioned, we do not feel that's the case, but could we do better? Absolutely. You'll see that there's only one college that has the ability to somewhat lock exterior doors. Locking doors is one of the probably top priorities among the colleges, and in the event that there is an event, that is a robust way to help prevent spreading or giving birth. Metal detectors, none of them have things like that. Surveillance cameras are a little bit of a mixed bag. Some campuses have more than others. When it comes to storm-ready campus or weather-ready ambassadors, you know, about half of our colleges are in that capacity and able to participate with that. Alert radios, you know, we have this whole Wyoming system. Some of our colleges are tied into that, some of them aren't. So that's kind of an interesting conversation that I learned with regard to their ability to tap into that system. Post-certified campus police officers, not all of our campuses have that. And a lot of that's another common theme that a lot of our colleges do have if they have that ability and the resources to have that. So what I was asked as I was preparing for this meeting to come up with is the other handout that I had, just the one pager. That is the top 3 priorities. You know, I think we've had several bills before the legislature in years past that look at studies. What resources do the colleges have? What can they do better? I think the colleges are at that point where they know what they can do to do better. And this is just estimates, and nothing is set in stone. But you'll see some commonalities among the colleges. And as I've mentioned, the ability to electronic lock doors is one of the top among the colleges. And also those post-certified officers, sworn officers, are something that's of most important. And then, of course, there are other little things, but they're big in terms of safety and security, panic buttons, mass notification systems, little things that maybe some of the bigger campuses have, but the smaller ones don't have it at all. Some of these costs are one time, and then, of course, if there are people involved there or maintenance for systems, things like that, then they have ongoing costs associated with them. So I wanted to give you a snapshot of what that looks like. Let you know that, at least from my perspective, there are things that we see K-12 doing that I know the colleagues have learned. In a conversation that I had with one of the members on the committee was, where are we doing that consistent with these kids who are in K-12 and then go to college? And then maybe we don't have a safety health program, you know, or something like that. So I think there's some lessons learned that all of us in this room can take to heart to say, what are we doing that can make all of us better? So really, Mr. Shanor, that's why I'm here today. And if there are specific questions, I would love to give it over to the experts in the room.
Erin, Mr. Chairman. Erin, I was looking through your survey here. Right there. I was looking through the survey here. Question 21, is there certification written into the job descriptions regarding CPR, basic first aid, and well-born pathogens? And I was surprised that human sources does not maintain a list of these. Who makes sure that these people are certified, and who keeps track of that certification?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Green, and that would be a question that I would put to
Dr. Caldwell?
Yes, Mr. Co-Chairs, Representative Piperinen, that does actually vary by college. It depends on how they've assigned those responsibilities. Each of the colleges does have a safety or safety and health committee that is required by their accreditation. So I want to be very clear about that. Within each of the colleges, how they've assigned either teams or specific individuals to manage that varies, and that's why it's very difficult to gain this particular component. But each of the colleges could identify how they are managing that separately, because it might not be an HR issue to where it might be something that lives within their safety and security, safety and health committee, for example, and where that lands in terms of the general population versus how do they manage that in, for example, the science labs. Those are also different aspects. So I want to be very clear on that. All of their, I would say their chemistry, their biology, those type of faculty, that is something that they have as a matter of their practice in good lab management. But how to do that overall for campus safety is a slightly different thing. So how the colleges and campuses manage that is going to vary by campus and depending on how they've got it structured, but we could probably get that information.
Okay, before we proceed, I want to recognize our Senate expert on community colleges who happens to be in the room, Senator Bill Landon.
Is he here?
He is here. Would you go ahead and stand up, please?
Oh,
Good to see you, Bill. You bet. Let's proceed.
Mr. Co-Chairs, I do want to mention that in my prior experience as a college president, I went through implementing these various components. Lockout, lockdown, in avoidance of catastrophic events, as well as the alert notification system. A little bit more, I would say, than the willing to tell, what's it called?
safe to tell.
Safe to tell, but also notification out, because those campuses are very different from K-12 because they're public and open campuses to the public at large. So having the ability for the colleges to do a notification system for a variety of different kinds of things that could be occurring, from the realities around weather. We know that our colleges have that, versus something that could be occurring in terms of an active incident. It does allow that capacity to make that notification to students, and it can do that even by location. As mentioned, our colleges, many of our colleges have more than one campus, and it allows them to customize that based on it. Having been through that and knowing how impactful it can be, it is the avoidance of an incident that keeps our students safe and our public safe, frankly.
Okay. Questions? Please proceed. Where do we go now?
Mr. Chairman, that is all the information that I have for the committee. I don't know if there are any other questions that we can answer. We didn't come forward with a request necessarily, but the opportunity to provide the information. And really that's why we're here. So I'm happy.
Okay,
to...
I think what we'll do, even though school safety and security is the entire item, but I think we might go ahead and take public testimony if there is some on the community college side. I think that's yeah. Dr. Leach, would you like to come up, Carla?
I would.
Yeah, that's what I done. But we have to go. Welcome, Dr. Leach.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. Really appreciate the opportunity to speak to you this morning and to get this part of the year going again. So I wanted to mention to you a couple of things about the list and about what we're working on here, because I do think at some point we are going to need some support on putting in some of these areas. As you know, and without me bringing up the entire subject, Western is using a lot of its major maintenance for a lot of new pipes and electrical units. And so whenever we start looking at the priorities on the college safety and security, those are the same dollars being pulled at from multiple perspectives. So I do hope that in the future we are able to come to you with some sort of consideration for support on the electronic locking mechanisms and the ongoing cost of the post-certified officers. Thank you. That is just an ongoing amount that we have. We know that we've moved into this world where we need to have trained officers on campus, and it's incredibly important that we have that available to us. And I'm not sure at this point, quite frankly, that our budgets are going to be able to handle those additional ongoing expenses, as well as just the cost of the locking mechanisms and what else we've put on here. Actually, all of the colleges have been through a safety survey, and so these are good numbers. These are numbers that we know this is what it's going to cost, both in the changes in staffing, training, and insurance, because we'll have some additional insurance requirements associated with having the post-certified officers on campus, not to mention the fact that post-certified officers fall under a different retirement system and some other benefits that we also would be responsible for. Unfortunately, our world has gotten to this point where we need to have this support on campus. And due to the configuration of our campuses, it is quite different. As you can tell from this campus, every building locks down independently. At Western, it's a single building with 37 access points. So the locking of that building is quite different than the locking of this building. And so the cost can be quite different from one place to the other. But I know that we want to work with you on this topic and make sure that we're addressing that. The last thing I wanted to mention, and I'll refer back to Erin just to make sure, but the Wyoming Association of Community College Trustees are having a college safety conference in Riverton on the October 17 and 18. I've heard most of those speakers, they come out of Oregon, where the Umpqua incident happened. They come from around the nation. These are about how we deal with these kind of situations within our open access community colleges. And I think that it's incredibly powerful information. And I really, really encourage you, not just as legislators, but as parents and grandparents, to come and listen to what they're saying. These individuals have lived through it. They understand not only the safety pressures, but the psychological pressures of putting together this amazing challenge for all of us in this world that has gotten a little out of hand. So on behalf of my trustees, I want to really invite you to spend some time with us for that conference. And Erin, I know, will provide you with everything she probably already has because she's so good at it. My last piece is I just want to tell you how incredibly happy we are to have Dr. Sandy Caldwell back with us. She is just a bright star, and we are just thrilled to have her at the commission. And it's a new day for community colleges. So thank you so much, sir, and ma'am.
Any special questions? Representative Kenner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Leach, thank you. So a lot of us on the committee have gone through the ALICE training that the schools are using. And I see the security priorities, and it's mostly hardware and those kinds of things, equipment. Could you speak for just a second to the personnel side, the faculty, the staff, the students, any training that might be going on currently there, or possible plans as you go forward? Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman and Representative Kenner, Absolutely. As a matter of fact, one of my colleagues from Sweetwater County is in the room. Superintendent Kelly McGovern is back here. She started 4 years ago or maybe 5 years ago with a group called ILoveYouGuys.org. It is an outstanding individual who comes and tells us about how the preparedness needs to be on campus, not only physically prepared for our organization, but also the recovery portion of it. He lost his daughter in a hostage situation in a high school in Northern California, Colorado. So our college has copied the school district as well as Sweetwater number 2. So the entire county has been through this, including our college. We're putting that in place. All of our first responders in town are a key portion of this. They attended the training with us as well. We have a lot of work yet to do to get it fully implemented, but it's incredibly important that this is a very continuous path, because not only are our faculty and staff responsible while they're on that campus, but they have children in that school district. So they're hearing part of it at home from their kids and they're hearing at work. Excuse me. So there's a continuous understanding of what this means. Also, between K-12 and the community college in Sweetwater County, we have the opportunity to use something called Schoolway, and that is our alert system. So when things are going on, if we have a shooter on campus or something like that, we're able to send that out to our entire community, so it is known community-wide. We pray every day that this doesn't happen, but we want to make sure that we're diligent and on target. So those are 2 examples of what we're doing with that. Also, Representative, we are on the morning or afternoon of the 18th as a part of the Wyoming Association Community College Trustees. Will be going through ALICE training as well. So I think the more that we all have a better understanding and we have consistent training, that prepares us better for an unknown situation.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Dr. Leach, I have a question as well, and for somebody, whether it's Erin or Dr. Caldwell, but one of the passions that we had in this committee that I was really involved in is the Safe to Tell program. And we've had great success. I think we've had great success with it. Is there a coordinated effort between the K-12 side of that and community colleges as it relates to Safe to Tell, which is a program that I happen to think a lot of? Erin, can you answer that better? Or?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Coe, that's a great question, and I'm glad you brought that up. It's my understanding that only a couple of the community colleges have the Safe to Tell, and more are interested in it. It is something we are talking about at our conference, and thank you for that, Dr. Leach. I should have been the one to discuss our own conference with you. You've all seen the information on it, hopefully from me, and I'll put some things over on the table for others who might be interested, but we have an entire panel talking about Safe to Tell. Bill Morris is going to be there to talk about, and as well as Director Cameron, and he's really excited to take that opportunity to, like I said earlier, let's try and find the gaps and bridge those gaps between K-12 and the colleges. And so I think that's going to be a really great panel for us at that conference. Absolutely. So we're working on that, Senator. Okay,
thank you very much. Anything else, Dr. Leach?
No, sir.
Anything else on the community college side of school safety and security before we go to the K-12 side? Seeing none, okay, we'll go to Dicky Shanor and Kylie Taylor.
Oh, Mr. Chairman, somebody did want, I think, public comment. Let's try that one more time.
I want to try public comment one more time. Anybody else like to make a comment? Please, please come up.
There we go.
Sorry I missed you.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. My name is Jim Huntington. I've attended one of these meetings a couple of years ago, actually been just about 3 years ago. The purpose of my visit with you this morning is to let you know of hopefully a pending legislation directed specifically at security at our community colleges. This will be a follow-up to Senate File 73, which was in 2014, and House Bill 204, which was in 2015, brought forth by Senator Nutting and Representative Gay, respectively. Working with my representative, the idea is to gain support and funding for increased security measures at our community colleges, to include post-certified officers at those community colleges and infrastructure requirements at those colleges as the respective community colleges deem necessary. I would just like to inform you that hopefully there's going to be legislation at the next session, and I would appreciate everyone taking a good look at that. I appreciate your time on that. If anybody has any questions following this session, I'd be happy to entertain any questions that you might have.
Thank you very much. Any questions? Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, thank you.
Sorry I missed you the first time.
That's fine.
Now we'll go to Dicky, Shanor, and Kylie Taylor.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, committee members, Dicky Shanor and Kylie Taylor from the Department of Education. We submitted a memo on this topic to provide an update on your interim priority number 2 related to school safety and security. The 4 topics we will touch on today are stakeholder collaboration and focus areas, school resource officers, arming school district staff, and school bus safety. At this time, Mr. Chairman, I will let Ms. Taylor talk to us about stakeholder collaboration and focus areas.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. As Chief Shanor mentioned, my name is Kylie Taylor, and I'm the Education Program Specialist at the Wyoming Department of Education. In August, the WDE coordinated a School Safety and Security Summit with the School Facilities Division and School Safety and Security Task Force. The summit took place in Cheyenne in conjunction with the U.S. Department of Education's Federal Commission on School Safety listening session. The session was led by Deputy Secretary of Education, Mick Zaz. This was a huge honor for Wyoming, as we were only one of 4 states that was selected to host a listening session. Our summit was the following day, and the summit highlighted National School Safety and Security expert Randy Braverman, and also included 3 breakout sessions centered on school-based mental health support for safe and successful schools, school facilities department, and best practices for school and law enforcement coordination. Following the summit, there were 3 major takeaways from the summit and task force member discussions. The first focus area was availability of school counselors and mental health resources for students. While the national data shows that Wyoming is doing pretty well in regards to counselor to student ratio, it was suggested at the summit to add more money to the funding model for mental health resources for students. Some of those resources would be trainings for teachers to help identify trauma, family problems, bullying, depression, and anxiety, school-based mental health services to provide access to services and supports to students and their families, and link community mental health services to schools, providing students with information on mental health conditions and how to ask for help if they see signs in themselves or a friend. The next focus area is emergency response technology. There are numerous vendors currently working with school districts to reduce response time for law enforcement to school incidents. Technology applications such as CopSync 911 or RAVE utilize a desktop or mobile app to reduce emergency time by an average of 3 to 4 minutes. RAVE is currently being utilized in Wyoming by Wyoming State Highway Patrol, Capitol and Governor's Office, Cheyenne Regional Medical Center, Memorial Hospital in Sweetwater County, Washakie County, Casper College, Central Wyoming College, Laramie County Community College, Northwest College, and the University of Wyoming. Our last focus area is relationship between school district leaders and local law enforcement. Many districts have a school resource officer, however, there is no statutory or rule requirement for them to do so. Exploring ways to have local law enforcement and school district staff in more regular contact is an important part of improving the overall safety of schools. If you have no questions, Mr. Chairman, at this time, I will pass it over to Chief Shanor to talk about school resource officers more in depth.
Okay, any questions or comments? Okay, please proceed, Dick.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Thanks, Kylie. The most comprehensive information we have on school resource officers at a state level is the 2015 recalibration report done by Pikus and Auden. And in that report, they referenced the survey done by WASBO, which is the Association of Business Officers in School Districts. And at that time, there were 54 SROs in Wyoming in 28 school districts. And those are all usually done cooperatively with a contract or an MOU with a local law enforcement agency in that school district. And there's split payment. So the law enforcement will fund some of it and the school district will fund some of it. Interesting note that at that time, when the survey was done, 98% of school districts expressed a desire to have SROs in their schools. So it's a very popular security measure in Wyoming. The report dives into a little more detail. And in fact, at that time, WASBO made specific recommendations referenced in that report about possible funding model components for SROs if that was a direction the committee wanted to go. You can see we laid those out in the memo. An example was one SRO for every 1,000 ADM, and then a smaller school apportionment as well, and then possibly even other security costs added in per ADM into the model as well. Ultimately, Pikus stopped short of making a recommendation on that topic during recalibration. But said if there was interest, it would need to be studied further and evaluated more. At this time, school safety and security is obviously a very important issue in our state, but also nationally. And states are doing different things related to SROs and this issue. One of those is Florida has what they're calling armed guardians, which who are citizens who are not actively employed in law enforcement, but will go through training by law enforcement to actually be on school campuses with firearms as security. Texas has a similar program. They call them marshals there, but those are actually paid school district staff trained at carrying a firearm, so a little bit of a different model. And then moving into what we potentially have in Wyoming, in addition to the SROs, is the legislation, House Bill 194, which was passed in the 2017 session, which gave local school districts the discretion on whether or not they wanted to arm their own personnel. And the bill laid out some pretty extensive criteria in what a district would have to do if they chose to go down that path. And as a result, the Department of Ed put together a stakeholder team with law enforcement officials, school boards, administrators, parents, got everybody to just go through that statute line by line and try to either offer insight onto what each requirement means, possible resources that might be available. For instance, if you have a teacher that wants to do this, where can he or she go get trained, etc. Put together a guidance manual on that to give to the districts last year. And since then, we've had 2 districts initiate the process of that bill and arming staff. And, one of them actually has been in litigation on whether or not they should have used the Administrative Procedures Act or not in using this. But at the moment, those 2 districts are the only 2 that have gone forward with actually utilizing this statute. And at this time, Mr. Chair, our last topic is school bus safety that Ms. Taylor has, unless there's any questions on those.
Questions? Representative Piperinen. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
my district, Wyoming County School District #1 was one of those districts that you mentioned. And as I was looking through the newspaper, the judge made a reference that there was some ambiguity in the language of the statute. Are you familiar with that?
There are a couple, I'm not familiar, excuse me, Mr. Chair, through you, Representative Piperinen. I'm not familiar with what exactly the district court judge referenced as being ambiguous. However, I did see the ruling in terms of basically erring on the side of going through the APA process, in that it was more of a substantive move, as opposed to what the district's position was, that it was just sort of an interpretive move. So there are some parts in that statute that do leave open some interpretation on who can be armed and what type of training is required. And that's why we tried to put in that manual just as much as we could from the different experts that were at the table to try to help districts navigate it. Mr. Chair, through you, probably the one that I would say is the most ambiguous in my reading is the exemption for like the small school district. There's a provision in that statute that exempts, I can't remember the exact phrase, remote or something along those lines, school district, but trying to find national definitions of what that means kind of just led us to the conclusion that you're probably safest to go through the hoops and not try to qualify as that exempt small or remote school district. But
Senator Ellis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Kind of building on that line of questioning, I don't know if the department's given any thought to kind of the broader implication of when the legislature gives school districts the option to adopt a policy for whatever. And I know Representative Bovee worked on some of those bills and we passed them last session, but does that case have a broader implication? And should we as a legislature be defining like or requiring that school districts adopt policies compliant with the Wyoming Administrative Procedures Act? Or I'm just wondering if the department's given that a broader thought or look.
Mr. Chair, through you, Senator Ellis, great question. We have not.
Further questions?
Representative Brown, I got that right.
We got it right, Mr. Chairman. Chief Shanor, quick question for you. I noticed that you guys polled WASBO. I'm just kind of curious if you guys have had any discussions with NASRO, the National Association of School Resource Officers, to try to get some input from them. You know, we're definitely getting one side of the story. I'd like to see if you guys have had any discussions with NASRO as to what they feel would be an appropriate level for school resource officers or funding or something, anything along those lines.
Mr. Chairman, through you, Representative Brown, just to be clear, we didn't pull WASBO. That was just referenced in that 2015 recalibration report. There was a WASBO survey that WASBO conducted on their own volition. In terms of NASRO, we stay in contact with the Wyoming Association of School Resource Officers and are working with them to get more up-to-date information on what they're doing. And in fact, specific to NASRO, one of the officers in our state organization is in Cheyenne and actually running for office in NASRO, Manny Ferdella. You've probably met him. And we've been in close contact with him, and he's kind of our conduit between the Wyoming Association and the National Association.
Jenny Freeman.
You probably don't have any official information on this, but when we started doing the cuts, people came forward and said one of the things that was going to be cut was school resource officers because it wasn't in the funding formula. It's my belief that we lost some, but do you have any more substantial evidence that happened?
Mr. Chairman, through you, Representative Freeman, we were hesitant to put out a survey on this topic because it was surveyed in recalibration, and we've been doing a heck of a lot of surveys lately, and so didn't want to put another one out. But we do intend to gather that information through the Wyoming Association of School Resource Officers and get an updated number shortly. So I can't verify that, but we can get that by November.
Further questions or discussion? Oh, Ted, sorry.
Mr. Chairman, I just want to make a comment. For the firearm, I just note that the school district under the order have to follow the APA in order to promulgate those rules. The main requirement of that, the procedural requirement is by 45 days notice, allow an opportunity for public comment. And then they can proceed with rules promulgation at that point. In terms of if the order has an effect upon other school district rules, I think is a great question. That, unless there's a Supreme Court case that comes down to this, rules on this issue, the order doesn't have impact beyond Uinta County School District and this specific issue. So a lot will depend on if there's an appeal in the case.
I might just add, Park 6 is the other district, obviously, and they went through the public hearing process extensively. I don't know if that makes a difference. I think it probably does. Ted, am I correct in saying that?
I don't know if Park 6 strictly followed the APA when they promulgated their rules and regs. Farm staff or allowed farming and stuff.
Okay, thank you. Other questions or discussion from the committee? Any other questions? Thank you very much. I think what we'll do before we consider the two pieces of legislation is take public comment.
They got some more.
School bus.
Pardon?
Yeah, school bus safety.
Oh, I'm sorry. School bus safety. Go ahead. It's all right.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
That's the second mistake I've made.
Our final topic will be on school bus safety, and in broader discussions of school safety and security, the topic of outfitting school buses with seatbelts has also been raised. But I believe that you heard more about that yesterday from our transportation director at the WDE. So unless you have any further questions on that, that is the end of our report.
Questions or comments? Sure.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. While we're talking about school buses, it occurred to me yesterday that we were talking about the ones that were bought with a federal grant. How many buses were bought with that federal grant dollars in this? 41. Mr. Chairman, 41. So we've got 41 new school buses that were bought with the, what's that acronym? DARA. DARA, thank you. Thank you. Okay, thank you.
And Mr. Chair, just to add on Ms. Taylor's comments, going forward, all buses will have seatbelts in Wyoming.
Is that right?
Got it.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, before we finish, I just wanted to mention and thank Representative Freeman and Senator Ellis for attending the School Safety and Security Summit in August.
Okay. Other questions or comments from the committee? Okay, we'll take, if it's okay, we'll take public testimony on the school safety, community colleges and K-12 prior to the two bills we have to consider. Is there any public testimony? Brian Farmer first.
Mr. Chairman, Brian Farmer, Wyoming School Boards Association. I would like to speak briefly about the litigation from Uinta County and the policy process used by that school district. This is very much related to the legislation that you'll be considering later today, as it's possibly an opportunity to extend amending that statute. The statute specifically is 21-3-132. That's the same one you're talking about. But this is the subparagraph A as opposed to B. I just want to tell you the very first words in that. It says the Board of Trustees in each school district may adopt rules and regulations. That's at the crux of the lawsuit in Uinta County, the words rules and regulations. In much of the language that's put into statute, we use the word policy. As a matter of fact, there's only one other instance that I'm aware of in Wyoming statute where we use rules and regulations for what happens with school districts versus the word policy. Now, there is still an open legal question as to whether or not the Administrative Procedures Act is required when the word policy is used versus the words rules and regulations. There is case law that suggests that when the words rules and regulations are used, that the Administrative Procedures Act does apply. That was at the heart of the litigation in Uintah County. Should we have the word policy or should we have the word rules and regulations? Now, policy does not mean that there's an absence of due process. Every school district has a slightly different process for the adoption of policies within their district. The Administrative Procedures Act has a direct prescriptive process to be used, and a part of that is 45-day notice to the public. Why that has impact in a school district is many of our school districts meet once a month. So 45 days has a literal impact of 60 days or a de facto impact of 60 days for that school district, because after that period of consideration, they won't be meeting for another 15 days. So it has that extended, that time frame. So is 30 days enough due process? If a school district offers 30 days for public comment within their policy process, as opposed to the strict rule of 45 days in the Wyoming Administrative Procedures Act. There are other elements within the Administrative Procedures Act that say that if a regulation is for the internal management of the district or the governmental entity, then the Administrative Procedures Act is not required. That may become an issue if it goes on to the Wyoming Supreme Court. The judge in the trial court found that that was not a persuasive argument. So there is a lot of process-oriented stuff, and it sounds like legal gobbledygook. But the words, rules and regulations that are in the statute may have some significant impact. In our member district, Uintah County School District number 1, is going to bring forward a resolution to Wyoming School Boards Association asking us to advocate for that change in statute. So I just want to make you aware that that's something that they're certainly asking for, would be more common with the ordinary practice. But even Park County School District number 6, in their adoption of the process, they used their ordinary policy process, and the question will come down to for them whether or not that was sufficiently aligned with the Administrative Procedures Act in order to meet specifically that 45-day requirement as notice. Of course, the elements of due process are notice and opportunity to be heard. People got to know what you're talking about, and they have to have an opportunity to give comment to that. So if that's in the policy-making process, it might be enough. So I would just offer for your consideration, maybe you want to change the words rules and regulations within that statute to the word policy, giving a little bit more flexibility to school districts. As Mr. Shanor said, there is further in that statute some lack of clarity as to what those small remote school districts are. There's not a single definition, so that's another area of possible amendment to that. So I just wanted to bring that to your attention. With regard to other school safety and security issues, I wanted to let you know that Wyoming School Boards Association is also making that a priority for development opportunities for school board members. We will have a school safety and security track as a part of our November conference. Speakers include Paul Tim and Daryl Scott. The I Love You Guys Foundation that the community colleges are using, we did bring them in a couple of years ago. So that continues to be on the forefront of our concerns as well.
What are the dates of your November conference for the school board here? It's here in Casper, isn't it?
It is, Mr. Chairman. It's the 15th and 16th of November, the Thursday, Friday prior to Thanksgiving.
Okay.
And certainly would love to have you all there.
I think it might work fairly well because I think we have caucuses here on the 17th, if I'm correct, on Saturday the 17th. So we'll see.
Mr. Chairman?
Any questions? Senator Ellis?
Mr. Chairman, just a request. I know this is an area that I'm really interested in, is the difference and distinction between rules and regulations versus policy. And, you know, I've had this conversation with my school board members of what is your process for adopting a policy? And I can't find it anywhere online. And I think that that's been a barrier for people in my district is knowing what the rules are if they wanted to petition their board for a specific policy. So I haven't looked at the other 47 districts and what's out there, but in understanding just kind of due process, I mean, that's an element of it too, is making people aware of what the rules are. So at your conference or at some point, I would love to visit with you about what your association's doing to just make that transparency greater, and maybe even providing some model guidance of, as you mentioned, if it's not 45 days and 60 days or whatever the circumstances are, but just please keep me in the loop as you work on that particular topic.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Ellis, just very quickly with regard to that, be happy to do so. One of the services that Wyoming School Boards does provide is a partnership with Board Docs. Board Docs is an electronic platform for the publication of school board policies on websites. And so we do encourage, whether it's through Board Docs or through other publication, the publications of policies. It's a little bit nerdy, but there is usually policy on policies that's going to be varied from school district to school district. So we'll certainly consider that, as our general counsel and I just had conversation last week about those very issues.
Other questions or comments for Brian?
All right, thank you very much.
Mr. Chairman.
Other public testimony?
Co-Chairman Northrup, Co-Chairman Coe. My name is Dan Mayer, and I'm Executive Director for Region 5 BOCES, and I'm going to speak to you regarding mental health issues. That's my interest in this topic. In the information provided by the WDE, they pardon me, the availability of school counselors and mental health resource students. And I wanted to address that topic because those ratios show that districts may have enough mental health resource in their district. And that is, I think that's not a true reflection of what's happening. And I just wanted to provide some light to that because guidance counselors, I think that's the number they're tracking. And guidance counselors, if you even ask them, aren't always trained in mental health practices. And so when we look at mental health providers in the schools, we look at school psychologists, school social workers, possibly some guidance counselors, because they can be cross-trained in becoming a licensed professional counselor. And so I'm just concerned that it may reflect a wrong impression to you that we have sufficient mental health services in the schools. And I've already heard testimony from yesterday saying that that's a need. And then I attended the school summit as well. I attended the mental health sections of those, and it was very apparent to me that a lot of districts had a lot of questions on what to do on this mental health aspect because it's very complicated. There's a lot of nuances to it, and I feel like we could really use some better direction and give districts some better direction on how to handle this very, I want to say, sensitive topic of mental health in schools because it's a touchy subject. And one of the sessions a parent brought up, they don't want kids targeted, because we want to profile and understanding, and our intent is to try to provide services to kids. But if a child's wrongly profiled and we're saying that they could be a school shooter, that could have some problems with it as well. And they gave some good examples of how that was misarticulated in a school district. I got some notes so I wouldn't lose my train of thought. And then I think we need to talk about better coordination with some outside resources. One thing that I'm a school psychologist myself, so I've practiced as that in Wyoming schools. And I've always told district leaders in many districts in Wyoming, the schools are sometimes the largest mental health provider in their communities. And I found that to be true when I was working in UN01, and excluding the state hospital, but I would even compare numbers. But we brought in every Pioneer Counseling and all those groups, and my professional group was larger than any entity there. And it kind of hit me at that point that many times we're the first ones identifying problems, we're the first ones, providing services, trying to get them to outside services. And I just think that needs to be really noted that we're there. And sometimes that's the only mental health services these students will receive in their lifetime. And so I just think that needs to be brought up. I think we should calculate what those services are. There are ratios for how many school psychologists there should be in a school. That's not captured in this. That's not part of that counseling ratio. And lastly, Wasatch Front, the school district there, has made an effort to put a school psychologist in every elementary school to provide those nuanced services. Because in Wyoming, most of the time I'm testing for eligibility for special ed, and I cannot provide that mental health service that I'm trained to do because I'm so busy testing kids and doing that. So I'll stand for any questions. I just wanted to give you some clarity on that topic.
Appreciate it very much, the clarity you brought. Questions? Representative Freeman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'm not going to ask any more questions, but I'd like to make a comment. I think that you're absolutely right. I deal with a lot of counselors, and they're just busy. Bottom line, busy. In high school, they're looking to help kids get into college. If there's any kind of emotional problem that's going on between students, I mean, they're dropped into the counselor's office. And I don't think that those questions or those ratios really demonstrated the benefit of mental health capabilities. I'm in my 41st year of being in public education. And for 23 years of those years, I was in an alternative school situation. And at the time, alternative schools were those kids, whatever in the hell that means. But I never felt safer in a school situation because, one, we knew the kids, and two, we had a counselor that was trained in emotional stabilities or whatever the proper term is. And I don't think by putting locks or putting armed guards in there that we totally protect our kids. We need to have those armed guards. We need to have those locks. We need to have the plans. We need to have the training. But we also have to deal with the kids that are there that need the emotional support or the emotional guidance. And I think what you said is spot on. We do, probably the largest collective group of mental health experts are in our schools, and they're understaffed. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Representative Freeman. Any other questions? Representative Bovee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I hear you when you talk about the difficulty of getting school sites. I know Natrona County is always short of school sites. We cannot get them here. Back in the olden days when I first taught, they used diagnosticians more than school psychs for doing that assessment so that perhaps the psych was available for doing that mental counseling. Are you familiar with that? And
I am.
Just tell me why we're not using diagnosticians now for that.
I can.
Thank you.
Chairman, Representative Bovee, back in the day, this is an issue because I sit on PTSB and we've had people apply for diagnosticians. And one of the problems is that there's no formal training for that anymore. I know there's a training program in Texas and there's a few around the state. So those programs have dried up as school psychology programs have blossomed out. And so to find that staff, that's why we're not seeing as many people with diagnostician, because they're opting to go into school psych programs. So we don't have many programs training people into this diagnostician, and you need to go through that training program to have supervised practicum experiences to be able to provide that. So there were more programs back in the day than there are now being able to feed that diagnostician profession. Is what even Wyoming, I think, had a program for that, and they don't currently have one for diagnosticians. That's why that's not there anymore.
Anybody else want to comment? Thanks, Dan.
Thank you.
Yes, we're still taking public comment.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. Janine Bayteski from Teton County. Back in August, I'll be very brief. Back in August, Brian and I went to National School Board Association conference in Chicago, and I testified to General Zaist. And I'll just leave you with one line because I wasn't going to testify until listening to what Dan had to say. I just want us all to reflect on this. School safety and security is not a school issue. School safety and security is a community issue. And we all need to join together on this as a community issue. Thank you.
Well said. Thank you. Any comments, questions? Anybody else? Public comment? Good morning.
Good morning. Mary Jo Lewis, Coordinator of Business Services for Park One. You all received a letter, I believe, from Superintendent Curtis from our district regarding the proposed draft legislation on LSO 0009, the classroom barricade devices. For the sake of the audience and just to get it out, our concerns on that bill, again, thank you very much for bringing that forward, but he was unable to be here. But the concerns we have is the minimum restrictions of Section A, not allowing the device to be permanently attached, excludes almost all the devices that are most effective and efficient and really does not move the needle past where we are today. It also excludes most of the devices that can be disarmed by admin and first responders with a special tool from outside the room. I know some of the concern with the fire marshal is that it's a fire safety issue. Again, if it gets locked, you know, kids just lock the door down. How do you get out? But there is a tool available for those. Also, the provision on line 19B, ensuring that any approved device meets applicable state and federal standards, takes us from what is currently a violation of code to a violation of the law. If we use any device that the fire code does not currently allow, this actually makes it worse for schools. Superintendent Curtis said basically, you know, we don't have another alternative to offer except for that perhaps we don't know, but this actually makes it worse than what we had before. We really would like it so we can do that attachments to the doors. So.
Well, when we work the bills, then we'll take public comment on the bills after each one of them. So,
okay.
Thank you. School safety and security.
Good morning, Co-Chairman Northrup and members of the committee. Walt Wilcox with the Natrona County School District, Associate Superintendent. Here to just speak with you a few moments and give some testimony towards school safety and where we are with especially the sworn officers and some testimony to why we'd continue to support this and the effort that's happening. Natrona, just as an update, I talked with you earlier at a separate session, is entered into some relationships with our local law enforcement agents. We'll be working with 6 school resource officers, tripling that from where we were previously as assigned sworn officers that are placed at our school's secondary systems and serving our elementary schools as well. We'll expand that to 9 and 10 over the next 3 years, working collectively with our Sheriff's Department for our rural and isolated schools, which include right under 6 of those environments that are served. The reason why I'm talking with you on this topic is I'm nearing my 3rd decade in school leadership and working in Wyoming as a school leader. Started out as a special education behavior specialist in some of our most needy classrooms for behavior. We're finding within Natrona and in talking with some of my other leaders around the state, and I'm guessing without even turning around as I give a little bit of testimony here, we'll see some head shaking or nodding going on that might confirm this with their current experiences. The opportunity to create school safety and everything that's been said earlier with a proactive approach towards the counseling and social and emotional is very valuable. But we're at a different era on where we are with school safety and security and the need to support and add security measures within our school environment. Natrona, as an example, was right under 4 dozen threats just from March to May last school year with school threats to either harm, shoot, kill, bomb, or cause physical damage to those within the school environment. That's a tremendous amount of effort and time with our local law enforcement agents and with our school officials. This school year, we're in the first 3 weeks of the school year and have dealt with 6 different threats ranging from transportation and school facilities that have created security measures to basically go through threat assessment and figure out if these are substantial areas. This did not exist when I first started in education, working with probably the most severe and neediest students. We are serving now more students than ever that the school is serving that are not emotionally or mentally supportive, and the school environments are serving those now. We spend nearly $2.5 million a year on out-of-district placements for individual students that are needing severe hospitalization or therapeutic services because we can't deliver those services within the school. Why I'm talking with you is I think there's some opportunity here. Districts are beginning to prioritize the sworn officers in a manner to help support, unfortunately, criminal activity that are occurring within the school environments and responses. Threat assessment, it's very real, and we will continue to carve off within Natrona the dollars to make that happen. They're coming from our classroom support areas in order to support that. And that's just the reality in order to support a safe and secure environment. In working very closely with our local law enforcement agencies, we're not just looking at possibly any fiscal commitment that can come and be dedicated towards those efforts. I think there's some other work that can happen because we're working with our other counterparts across the state. These are happening in isolation and not very consolidated. So I would put some recommendations for the committee to either consider if this is something legislatively could be supported, or could it be coordinated perhaps through the Department of Education. As we're working with just components on what it's going to look like with sworn law enforcement agents, from boundaries of search and seizure to what happens with privacy rights of students in guiding that, what it's going to look like to access security systems, to be able to carry lethal or non-lethal weapons. These are all measures that are happening within the local memorandum of understandings in areas that are not providing much guidance on what they are. So school districts are beginning to share those individually, but there's not a collective guidance to guide what should happen in working with our law enforcement agents in these areas to guide this with more consistency and support. I worked very closely with Laramie 1 in trying to look at the memorandum of understandings, but in visiting with other colleagues around the state, there's a need to support these conversations and what those boundaries would look like with sworn officers on the roles within the school setting. So I think there's another opportunity to help guide and solidify that with the 40+ districts around Wyoming. So I come to you today just with some testimony that we are at a different point, at nearly 3 decades of personal experience, that never have we been dealing with so much instability, unfortunately, with the mental health sector within public schools. Not trying to chuck that responsibility or put that off, but it's a very real component in taking a look at serving all the needs of students and not just those that are most needy students on the mental health side of things. So I'd stand for questions, but just to give you an update on where we are with Natrona and the support for the conversations that are happening around these topics.
Questions or comments? I have one question for you. I was here for the kickoff of Safe to Tell, and that happened in Natrona 1. Can you talk about maybe the benefits of the Safe to Tell program?
Very much so. We find that as one of our most effective interventions for pre and, if you can believe it, post-intervention follow-up. So these tip lines that are happening from students, adults, community members at all ages have allowed us to get ahead. And that's one of the opportunities where we've seen more involvement on the school threat side of things, is the Safe to Tell has been almost a factor in nearly all of these tips that we've worked that I've named in those quantity of numbers. Very effective. We continue to deploy that and use that as a system. And in the response rate, if you're not familiar with this, a leader, our school principals who are the contact of the structures that exist within the environments, these calls and these notifications come in 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. So we'll watch our leaders working with local law enforcement agents responding to threat analysis on a Saturday night, early in the morning, a Sunday, early morning, holidays. It doesn't rest now. School safety is working 24 hours a day, and this tip line has been one of the most effective strategies for folks to communicate when they're not feeling safe in those areas.
Other questions or comments? Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Superintendent Schulte from Park 6, how are you?
I'm well, thank you.
Okay.
Good morning, Co-Chair, Senator Coe, and members of the committee. Ray Schulte, Superintendent, Park County School District Number 6. I'm not sure if I heard some conversation about the proposed bill or not, but I'll make this real quick. So within the legislation, you talked about this in June, and I visited with the committee about in the state statute, it says school boards can authorize employees under contract. We had a long discussion about that. I see that there's a recommendation to remove that language, which would allow school districts, if they so choose to arm school employees, they could arm classified employees such as custodians or food service people, maintenance people. Currently, our district chose not to do that. because those employees are at will and they're not under contract. So if that language were changed, I think we would appreciate it very much. It would give us a lot of flexibility. And as Brian Farmer talked about, rules and regs, it seems to be a bit of a hang-up. And if that were changed to school districts adopting policy, if there's a concern that there's not adequate time for public hearing, maybe add the language with the 45-day public hearing or something to that effect. I think most school districts use a minimum of 30 days to adopt policy. That certainly could vary. But if that, and I think it would make sense to have a 45-day hearing period. It's, you're talking about a pretty serious measure. I think it deserves time for public input, and to change it to allow school districts to adopt policy with a minimum 45-day hearing period, I think would address the concern. That's all I have.
Superintendent Schulte, thank you. Any questions or comments? Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Other public comment?
Good morning. Co-chairs and committee, I'm Teresa Chalk from Lincoln County School District number 1. One quick point. I love the information Dicky shared, but if you look at this sheet that says the ratio of counselors per student, I just want to remind you that these are unfunded positions because we have them K through 12. So we have more counselors than we're funded for. So I just want to remind everybody that that is an issue that we need to consider moving forward.
Comments? Thank you. Other public testimony?
Mr. Co-Chair, members of the committee, I'm Carol Jellicoe. I'm a trustee for Sweetwater County School District number 1. And I just wanted to piggyback on what Teresa had mentioned. We've made it a priority in our district to put a counselor in each of our elementary schools because of the need with the mental health issues. We're seeing more violence among students and so forth. So we've made that a priority. And just to piggyback on what she said, we're doing that at a cost, because our instructional programs are paying for that because the counselors are not addressed in the funding model. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Other public testimony? Other public testimony? Okay, public testimony.
We're going to take up 2 bills. I think I'll have Ed or whoever wants to present the bill to us. You want to do it right now?
If that's okay with you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. My name is Kayla Spencer. I'm a staff attorney with the Legislative Service Office. I may be a new face for some of you. I only started August 1st. So the bill draft I'll be discussing is 19 LSO 0097, and that relates to firearms in the school. As superintendent for the Park County School District number 6, refreshed your memory about the conversation that occurred at the June 6th and 7th meeting of this year. This bill addresses that concern. It's a pretty quick bill. On the first page, we've stricken under contract with the Board of Trustees of. On the second page, we added by. We also took out on contract with and added of. What those changes do, it just has the effect of allowing, it's redefining employee to include any employee with the school district. It would no longer have to be an employee specifically under contract with the district. The rest of the bill remains unchanged. It still allows for the school district board of trustees to adopt rules and regulations in consultation with law enforcement to allow employees to conceal and carry. And with that, I'm available to answer any questions.
Okay, I think what we'll do here, I think we'll go ahead and work both of the bills and not vote on them today. We'll wait and actually vote on them in November in case there's amendments that come up. That's okay with the committee? That's what the co-chairs have decided. Any questions or comments on that bill? Okay, let's go to, excuse me, Senator Ellis.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Chairman. When I saw this on the agenda, the title of the bill, Firearms and School Property, made it seem like we're maybe opening up the whole bill for discussion, and maybe I would like to know if it would make some sense to rethink how we, the title of this bill, and I don't know
we want to narrow it to more of an employment contract, person employed, something like that, instead of this broad bill title. Just a thought.
Any comments, or anybody over there, staff, have any comments?
Mr. Chairman, are we talking about the catch title or the formal bill title?
The catch title, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, the catch title has no legal effect, but the committee can change it to whatever it would like.
Is there any proposal to make a change? Would we do anything different? Okay.
Mr. Chairman.
Senator Roberts. Wow.
I'll just say that while maybe we have an opportunity to come up with a better title, I think even though the catch title has no legal significance, Senator Ellis is exactly right that we should narrow this to the point where we're not going to have 100 people in the room for the conversation that want to broadly change the statute that we spent so much time working on. So I'll work with Senator Ellis and anyone else interested to try and come up with a much narrower title as a catch title and title.
Any other comments?
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Co-Chair, go ahead.
Thank you. And as was brought up also in Section A of the same statute is the rules and regulations. And if we want to look at changing that to policy or however we want to handle that, that's the appropriate time to do that is in this bill.
Absolutely. Totally agree. Other questions or comments? Okay, let's go to the next bill, which is LSO 009, classroom barricade devices.
So, the school staff to use barricade devices based on rules promulgated by the Council on Fire Prevention and Electrical Safety in Buildings. So that council has statutory authority to promulgate the fire code and the building code for the state. What this bill would do is require the council to develop rules to authorize the use of barricade devices that would prevent the ingress or egress through a door in a school building for a limited period of time during an emergency. This language is based in part upon law that's been enacted in the state of Ohio. And so the state of Ohio authorized their rule-making process and their rules to include training requirements for staff who are going to use this. They also authorized that any approved device not be permanently mounted to a door. And then there was legislation in Utah that addressed this issue that talked about ensuring that any approved device meets applicable state and federal standards. And I think what they're getting at is just making sure that devices comply with the American with Disabilities Act and other pertinent requirements. Those two provisions, those subparagraphs A and B, certainly could be removed from legislation if the committee chooses to do so. I don't think that causes any fatal issues with it. So the policy call the committee can make. And then you'll notice on page 3, there's a provision that addresses local enforcement of these rules and regs. So cities, towns, counties can adopt fire codes, building codes that are more protective than what the state adopts. So this language on page 3 would require those cities, towns, and counties that have jurisdiction over a school building to enforce the rules that allow the use of these barricade devices. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I'd be happy to answer any questions about the bill.
Questions of Ted on the bill by the committee? Okay, we got Representative Bovee down there.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ted, by removing A and B, does that in any way address the email that we received, those concerns?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Bovee, I've not seen the email. From comments earlier today, it sounded like the concern is that this would prevent use of desired devices, desired barricade devices. That may be the case. I imagine that some barricade devices would be permanently mounted to the door. If I had to guess what Ohio was doing when it adopted this language, perhaps it allows more flexibility for school staff to have these things put away from students. I don't know exactly. I'm not an expert on classroom barricade devices, but I imagine they had some sort of reason for imposing that requirement.
I might just, at this time, go through an email that I've gotten from the superintendent up in my area with concerns he has with the bill. And I think it's easier just to read it. He says, I do have some concerns with the language of the bill, as it does not achieve what I believe we're trying to accomplish. The minimum restrictions of paragraph A, not allowing the device to be permanently attached, excludes almost all of the devices that are most effective and efficient, and really does not move the needle past where we are today. It also excludes most of the devices that can be disarmed by administration and first responders with a special tool from outside the room. Also, the provisions on line 19, paragraph B, ensuring that any approved device meets applicable state and federal standards, takes us from what is currently a violation of code to a violation of law if we use any device that the fire code does not currently allow. So that's the comments from in an email that I bring for the benefit of those as we consider this bill. Senator Ellis?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I believe I requested this bill draft, and I think we have more work to do on the language. And I did visit with our fire marshal, and I think we've just got a lot of work to do to understand what our condition of our schools are in. And I know a lot of work has been done on that front. But to kind of put a finer point on how this is I'm unclear on what the exact rules are. I mean, if you look at the doors in this building, there's the arm that's on the top. And my understanding is there are devices you can put on top of that arm that would prevent it from opening. And those are not permitted by the fire code. But in visiting with the person that provided our ALICE training, I heard that something that would go over that arm, as long as it was kept in a bag that said, for emergency only, somehow that would meet fire code. So I think we've got a lot of work to do to really understand what we're trying to achieve. But I think we can work on this some more and take it up again at our November meeting.
Yeah, and I'll tell you, we are going to take, we aren't going to vote on the bill today. We are going to take public testimony on it. So any further comments from the committee?
Mr. Chairman.
Senator Rothfuss.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. One thing that we can think of doing, and I realize we can do it next time, but if we simply remove 13, 14, and beyond, those restrictions shall at a minimum, and then remove A and B, it doesn't even preclude nuances of those restrictions from being part of the rules and regulations, but it would then go through a rules and regulations process where the stakeholders would be at the table. If they ended up having problems, they could amend the rules and regulations. So I think perhaps on this one, our key is to give that high level directive and then let the stakeholders figure out the details. Mm-hmm. And honestly, we could probably do that today, but certainly something that we can look at next time as well.
Okay. Thank you, Senator. Any further comments or questions? Okay, we'll go to public comment. We'll go public comment on the first bill. 97. Any public comment on 97? Public comment on 97? Okay, seeing none, we'll go to public comment on 0009, classroom barricade devices.
Thank you, co-chairs, members of the committee. Travis Sweeney, business manager, Fremont 1. I just wanted to share an example of what a barricade looks like in Fremont County School District number 1 and the nuance of being permanently attached. So we've adopted, or we've placed in all of our rooms, it's called the night lock system. One piece attaches permanently to the floor and another piece attaches permanently to the door. It prevents egress and ingress. And this little device sits in a box on the wall. And in an emergency, it's just slid down into the locking mechanism. Yeah, so this is an example of what, but I think if what Senator Rothfuss just discussed would alleviate all those issues. So thank you.
Representing Piperina.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was just curious the cost of something like that.
Mr. Co-Chair, Representative Piperinen, we put these district-wide, and I believe it was around $35,000 for the district. Follow-up.
Individually, the apparatus.
I believe it was somewhere around $25. I don't know the exact dollar amount, but it's been a couple years. So.
Thank you, sir. Can you tell me if that can be opened from the outside if with a special tool?
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Co-Chair, Co-Chairman Northrup, yes, each administrator in the district is given a tool that they can slide under the door and unlock the device.
Excellent. Thank you.
Questions? Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Any public comment on 0009? Any other public comment? Okay. Public comment closed. 8:30, this is for a break. Come back here at about 10:30, about 10 minutes. Take up further education, physical efficiency.
efficiencies now. And if time permits before lunch, we're going to go right into education accountability. And then right after lunch, we'll take up early childhood education and hopefully get out of here at a fairly decent time. So with that, Dicky, Shanor, Megan Degenfelder, special education fiscal efficiencies.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. Again, Megan Degenfelder and Dicky Shanor with the Department of Education. You will recall at the June committee meeting, the department presented to the committee on its review of special education state statutes, as well as efficiency recommendations. And today we will provide an update on our work to achieve those fiscal efficiencies in special education. We will also provide updates on preliminary 17-18 expenditures related to special education and the 1920-2021 funding limitations. First, on page 1 of your memo is updates on Chapter 44 proposed rules. The current guidance around reimbursable expenses for special education are fairly broad and open to much interpretation as they are within the Chapter 8 school finance rules. The newly created Chapter 44 rules, provide a greater deal of clarity around reimbursable expenses, particularly related to supplies and equipment, professional development, other indirect costs, and technology. Those rules have been vetted through several stakeholder committees, and they are currently out for public comment until October 14th. After that time, the governor will enter the 75-day review process. The next update is regarding our work with the Government Efficiency Commission. In May, the department submitted 2 proposals to the commission for them to study specifically related to special education. The first was to study Medicaid reimbursements, and the second, a regional service model for special education. Those proposals are currently pending as the governor's office continues its negotiations with potential vendors to complete the studies. We're hoping to know more information in the coming weeks. The next update is on staffing guidelines. The department recently completed a comprehensive review of staffing guidelines across the nation. We found that there's actually very little research around adequate staffing levels in the country, and that from state to state, the levels vary greatly within the individual ratios as well as the methods in which they use to implement those. Therefore, the department, in collaboration with stakeholder groups, is moving forward on a statewide survey in which we intend to collect caseload data for certified and classified personnel. With this data, we will analyze and include calculation measures of central tendencies in order to decide the best measure for which to develop staffing guidelines. The overall idea here is to develop Wyoming standards based on Wyoming practices. We will continue to work with those stakeholder groups throughout the year to ensure that these guidelines are completed by the January 1st deadline. Mr. Chairman, on page 3 of your memo are 2017-18 preliminary special education expenditures. You'll recall that districts are reimbursed allowable special education costs based on prior year expenditures. Table 1 includes a 5-year historical expenditures outline by category. You'll see that for preliminary 17-18, total expenditures are roughly $244.3 million. This is a yearly change from 16-17 of 2.36%. Appendix 1 at the end of this memo also includes those expenditures by individual district. Table 2 includes enrollment numbers. You'll see for 17-18 that special education enrollment was 12,949 students, which is 13.93% of total enrollment. Finally, on page 4, a brief update on the 1920 and 2021 funding limitations. You'll recall that in the 2018 budget bill, the amounts reimbursed to school districts for special education for 1920 and 2021 will be limited to the amount reimbursed in 18-19. In other words, capped to the amount that were expended in 17-18. The legislature also included a $2 million appropriation for out-of-district placements that exceed this limitation. The department will make available $1 million per year to districts, and a district can qualify for a portion of this appropriation if they have increased cost of out-of-district placements, as well as increased costs of total special education expenditures. Their amount of this appropriation will be dependent on the lesser of those two increases and will be commensurate with their proportion of the statewide increase of those lesser amounts. Appendix 2 includes an example of how this process will work with hypothetical data, and I'm happy to go into any additional detail on that. Mr. Chairman, with that, that concludes our update on special education efficiencies and preliminary expenditures. We'll stand for any questions.
Okay, thank you, Megan. I do have one question. One of the concerns, the co-chair and I had a meeting with our special ed people up in Park Section, Park 1 the other morning, and we have 30 new special ed students in our district in Cody, and I think it's 23 in Powell, in Park 1. So how do you deal with that? I mean, it appears to me that people are moving here to Wyoming because of the way we deal with special education, and we do it very well. Do you have any comments on that? I mean, how do we deal with that when we're basically freezing funding? Right. Yes.
Mr. Chairman, I would note, and you'll also see in that appendix 2, that if a district does decrease in their enrollment, that money will funnel through and be allocated to the districts that increase, as well as that $2 million appropriation. But you bring up a very difficult question, and those funds are limited to for those 2 years based on 18-19 in which those numbers are received.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Degenfelder, I'm just kind of curious, if I'm looking here at 2015, 2016, and I just see a drastic spike in salaries and benefits, and then if I go down and I look at the enrollment, I see an enrollment that's fairly flat. I don't see a drastic increase in enrollment for special ed. I'm just kind of curious if you have the capability, or if you maybe have any, maybe going on a limb here, but if you can identify why we had such a massive spike in salaries and benefits with a reduction or a relatively stagnant enrollment. Maybe there's a reasoning for that.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Brown, I would only note that historically we have had a 100% reimbursement for special education expenditures. And so that would be, I think, a more appropriate question for the individual school districts.
Sure.
Senator Office.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. On that question, though, we know with special education more so than with traditional education that the individual student needs can vary dramatically in terms of the costs associated with that. A lot of the salary that we see is going to be based on what's the level of need. So if we've got one student that simply needs an hour a day and a para, that's going to be very different from one that needs one-on-one, OT, other things. So I think that's probably why we see it. We can hear from public comment, but I suspect that the looking at the aggregation across the state is probably useful. Looking at any individual school district like we have here, I mean, it's random lot of kids.
Further questions, comments? Any further questions or comments? Matt.
Mr. Chairman, just 2 points. One, on salaries and benefits, part of the reason you see from 13-14 to 17-18 is the state has increased the state share of retirement costs. So the state's paying a portion of that. Another piece of the anomaly we talked about yesterday, that the transportation aids for special education students, the department offered guidance yesterday on the proposed rules for districts to code their 17-18 expenditures related to transportation aids for 17-18. Those costs again are covered under the 3-year average. I think for at least for 16-17 to 17-18, part of that increase related to the free coding of those transportation costs.
Okay. Thank you, Matt. Further questions or comments? Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
We'll go to public testimony on this particular item. You come forward and identify yourself.
I'm going to bring a team of people, so hopefully we can get as many special ed people up here. Don, who was our third? Oh, that's not here yet. Co-Chairman Northrup, Co-Chairman Coe, Dan Mayer, again, Region 5 BOCES, represent Wyoming Association of Special Ed Administrators. And I have Dallas Myers with me from Riverton, Fremont 25, Don Scarens from
Wyoming Indian, Fremont 14. Steve Slyman, Albany County School District number 1, Laramie.
And so we would like to address some of the questions that were brought up earlier and make a few general comments. First comment, on behalf of WCCC and our whole organization, we just had a fall conference, but we would ask to be put on the November agenda to allow us time to be able to get some accurate data to you, to talk about our counts. Senator Coe, you mentioned meeting with your Park County folks, and we're seeing that trend in the state, these fluctuating numbers, and I can even highlight a few more of those numbers for some of the areas that you have. And October 1st is our count time, so we'll have a better reflection of what the increases were, because we're seeing some districts in their overall population are decreasing and the special ed is increasing, and we'll have a better understanding of why those numbers may be occurring. And we would also we understand the situation that we're in the state, and we would like to offer possibly our solutions from our organization. We will continue to work with the Department of Education to fill out the survey and get the information that they need. But I think we may look at things a little bit different than they do, and we would maybe bring some different solutions to the table than they may have. They're going to be looking at staffing ratios, and we would like to bring and be able to spend some time, not on a short public comment, to be able to sit up here, present some information, and have a discussion from the district perspective. Let's see here. I'll pass it. So maybe just some context from the districts now.
My name is Dallas Myers. I'm with Fremont.
You move the microphone so you can get it as close as you can there. We only have the one there, so you're going to have to move it around a little bit.
Dallas Myers, Fremont 25 in Riverton. Thank you, Co-Chair Northrup and Co. and committee. I've been a public educator for 28 years. I've always refrained from the political environment, if you will. I've always trusted you all to do your job, and I'd stay home and do mine. And that's kind of the way that I've approached things in Wyoming. And I think that you all do as well, being elected from your representative areas. However, I don't come to special education through a traditional means. I'm not a social worker. I'm not a school psychologist. I'm an ag teacher, and I taught ag for 7 years, and I taught biology and chemistry. I've taught everything from 3rd grade to junior college levels. In working with agriculture, though, I often got to work with behavior kids and at-risk kids, because when you keep their hands busy, their minds and their bodies stay pretty well engaged. So having done that, I got into a behavior environment in a classroom. And then I was a high school administrator for 6 years, and I've been a special education director for 9 years. And I think as I was very apprehensive and I didn't know what I was going to say, I opened up some mail and I read it this morning. And I read a excerpt from Mark Uptain's brother-in-law, and a recount how Mr. Uptain and Jackson stood toe-to-toe, as he said, like Mike Tyson with the grizzly bear. And I thought, if Mark Uptain could do that with a grizzly bear, then I could stand before you and give you testimony and based upon my beliefs and not be too fearful. So having said that, I think that some of the things that I was unaware of, and some of the things that I think this freeze and this cap has put in place, is going to be problematic. For one thing, in our district, we're down 24 as an enrollment overall, but we're also up 42 students from last spring to this spring. 32 of them, or 29 of them, are in-state transfers, and 13 are out-of-state people that came in from out-of-state. So we see a huge mobile population within Fremont 25, but I think overall in the county, our special ed numbers are up. My first education conference I went to as a special educator, there were 32 attorneys presenting. And I was more into instruction, education, pedagogy, and those kinds of things. I was a little bit taken back about how litigious special ed law is. If we refuse a placement through the Department of Family Services, there's no recourse or due process that a parent or family or an advocate could take to ensure that their student or their son or daughter was appropriately placed. Within special education, there's a whole bunch of due process, and we're not let off the hook as much. I think one of the things that I'm fearful of as we look at this, and an unintended consequence of this freeze, is out of these 42 new students from last spring, if I receive one that has an IEP from an adjacent state or a neighboring state that has a service donkey on their IEP, I've always had the luxury of being able to work with the IEP team, the family, and the community to provide, implement a reasonably calculated IEP, where I'm going to be strapped with the budget and constraints because not only of the freeze, but because of an increasing enrollment. I'm not going to have the luxury to do that. And one of the things, being a Wyoming native and having grown up in Riverton and worked in a number of districts across the state and gone to the University of Wyoming, that really galls me is federal people making decisions about how we live in Wyoming and what we do. And we are opening the door, changing the landscape of making that happen if this continues, because a 10th Circuit Court judge somewhere out of state, somewhere else, is going to make that decision about whether we bring that service donkey into our school. And you're going to change the landscape of our public education system because of it. The other thing I like to point out is the fact that, you know, in Wyoming, we do a lot of really good things, really great. And the rest of the country may or may not do them that way, but that's okay, because we're going to do what's good for us in Wyoming. And it's not necessarily always going to be what everybody else is doing. And I encourage you to stand up for that and continue to do what's important for us in Wyoming, and not just because South Dakota or Montana or some other states are doing it. It's going to greatly impact that. It's going to change the landscape of the way that we do special education and public education in Wyoming, because attorneys, whether we like it or not, we fought with the grizzly bear, for instance, when we had state control and we lost it. We had state control and we lost it. With IDEA and special education, we do not have state control. When I go into a courtroom and a due process hearing with an attorney, they look at the federal regs, and that's what they hold me accountable to. And through the funding that we've had with the 100% reimbursable expenses in special education, we're able to provide a reasonably calculated IEP. And we've stayed out of the craziness that can exist in special education with the requests that come from parents and what we provide for their students, for their son and daughter. And I think this is ultimately foundationally going to change that. So I'd encourage you, as you look at enrollment, I'd encourage you to really rethink and look at those things from a standpoint of, this is Wyoming, this is what's best for us. And look at us as colleagues and special ed directors and WDE and the oversight that we already have with audits to help us change those efficiencies to become better at what we do. And we want to be a part of that solution. We understand the crisis that we're in financially, and we want to be a part of that. But we don't want to throw, for sake of a better analogy, the baby out with the bathwater, because we already do a lot of things really well. And we want to be a part of that solution. And I'd be happy to entertain any questions or any thoughts that anybody has. Thank you, Senator.
Just a comment, we appreciate that, because, you know, wanting to be part of the solution is really paramount to us, because we do have a financial crisis and really, really respect that. Okay, questions, comments? Okay, who else? Welcome.
Hi, Co-Chair, Senator Coe and Northrop. Thank you again for all of your time and effort on these topics. As you can tell, we're all pretty passionate about this, and as it directly affects the children and the families.
So will you please identify yourself for the record, please?
Oh, okay. My name is Dawn Scarence. I'm the Special Education Director at Wyoming Indian Schools, Fremont County 14. So we are the ones sitting across the table helping parents make these decisions about what services we can and can't provide to their students. And to piggyback on what Dallas was saying, I do want to be part of the solution to this problem. Part of the reason I'm here too, I'm usually a behind the scenes person, but I think you may have seen my face at some of your meetings this past year. I might be looking familiar to some of you because I have been coming and speaking up more often. I have I've participated on the WDE's Results-Driven Accountability Task Force. They're the ones that do we're designing our monitoring for special education. I was part of the Efficiency Task Force. When you asked WDE to come up with SPED efficiencies, I was part of that. We went painstakingly through every piece of legislation, trying hard to find efficiencies that maybe the previous auditors had missed. I'm also on the Staff Guidelines Task Force, so I'm trying really hard to work together with the Department of Individual Learning and WDE and try and find solutions to our problems. I've been teaching special education in Wyoming since 1985. I worked for 14 years in the early childhood developmental delay area, so I have experience working in those, the Part C part of the law. And then I worked at Wyoming Indian as a special education teacher at the middle school, and this is my 10th year as a director. So I do feel like, we want to work together. I have some history of how things have worked in Wyoming before, and I can second what Dallas says. My fears about our responsibility to follow OSEP and IDEA regulations, we will find ourselves in a position where we might not be capable of doing that and opening our districts up. So I guess very briefly that now, I think my public comment to you would be, I intend to work hard with the Division of Individual Learning and try and come up with solutions. At the end of the day, when I'm sitting across the table from a parent or a student who has a disability, I have to make my decisions based on that student's needs. Senator Rothfuss was absolutely correct. At the end of the day, that's what it has to be. And those needs are determined, not mamby-pamby. Those needs are determined by thorough evaluations, comprehensive evaluations. We have professionals, licensed professionals, signing their name on reports, authorizing that these are the things that the student needs. We have another group of people that come together in an individual education plan meeting, and those professionals sign their names to say, yes, in fact, to meet IDEA standards, this is what the student needs. And as special ed director, I can't say, well, because of funding cuts, we understand they need this, but we can't offer it. I can't say that. I can't say, that's part of free appropriate public education. That's the prime directive of IDEA. I can't say, we're going to take all you kids and group you over here because we know it's more cost effective to serve you over here rather than serve you in your general education environment. I can't do that either because that's a violation of least restrictive environment, another prime directive of IDEA. So we're going to work together, but at the end of the day, we have to be able to meet those kids' needs. We have to provide FAPE, we have to provide a free, appropriate public education in the least restrictive environment. And that has to drive our decision making.
Questions, comments?
Thanks very much. Down to the end here.
My name is Steve Slyman. I'm the Director of Individualized Instruction in Laramie, Wyoming, Albany County School District number 1. Our vision is to entrust and empower everyone to excel. Our mission statement is to educate all students to achieve at their highest potential, to graduate, and to succeed in life. My job and the job of other special education directors here in our state is to create pathways for that to occur for all students. I just really wanted to make sure you understand the wide array of work that we do, starting with students who are age 4, working with developmental preschools, preparing and planning to best meet their needs when they enter kindergarten in our schools, up through the age of 21, when students are trying to find ways to succeed in life. We work diligently every day to create opportunities for students to experience that success. That can mean a great deal of work to develop programs and plans and opportunities outside of school to help them be successful. We need to make sure we have the flexibility within our school systems, in our schools, in our school districts to create opportunities that best meet the needs of the students that we see each and every day. And those are different depending on where those students are and where they're coming from. That's one of the things that I want to be able to participate with the WDE and with you legislators is making sure that we have that flexibility statewide based on our districts, based on our schools to enable the success of all students. Thank you.
Questions or comments?
I think the last comment, Senator Coe, that you brought up was, are people choosing to come here just based upon the 100% reimbursement? And I think our large collective voice would say no. I don't think that's the normal. I think that's the exception to the rule. I've talked to many districts and asked them that question. And with some of these fluctuations, I know that Teresa Chalk has, I spoke with her director, Brad Martin, and they had 5 autistic students with significant needs move in. 2 of them were family related, and 3 of them were jobs in the area. And so I don't feel like that's really driving that we're having all this influx. I do think we need to figure out what's bringing these populations in. I know sometimes we get an uptick of students because of students that we're transitioning kids out for high school graduation, and then we're getting an influx of kids coming in from the preschools that are identified. And that could be a player in that. But we do need to identify some of those numbers. But honestly, I don't think that we're getting 80% of our kids are coming in because they've heard in Nebraska that special ed is 100% reimbursed. I don't see that day in and day out. There may be a few families when they're looking at different job opportunities, high professionals, and they're going to look at our education system and they have a disabled child. But again, I think that would be the exception from what I've heard from my colleagues. I just wanted to address that because I hear that mentioned.
Thank you very much.
I'd like to say one more thing. We meet with our stakeholders to try to figure out these exact same problems. So when I talk to you and to my local legislatures, which I have, we have some insight. And meeting with my school nurses just this week, I was, what's going on? What's happening? And one of my school nurses worked for 12 years as a maternity nurse. And she said in the last 2 years in delivering babies, that they were saving babies' lives that were born early or with health issues that 10 years ago they would not have been able to save. And so we're seeing these kids show up in our school system with these severe disabilities and medical and health needs, and we're educating them and providing those students with those opportunities. So I think that's changed the landscape a little bit, and I've definitely seen it change within our district. And we're going to have more and more of that instead of less and less, which all of this is a basic human right issue. And I think those things are all important. And I appreciate your time.
Thank you very much.
Just one last addition to what Dallas was sharing with you, along with the medical and physical challenges, we're also seeing a huge spike in mental health issues on a daily basis, and the emotionality that comes along with a lot of those mental health issues that we have to respond to.
Okay. Representative Freeman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll be real brief. I don't think people come into the state looking to get into the special ed system, but I do know I've had 2 people going door to door that have mentioned that once they got here and they saw the quality of education that they have, they don't leave. And one gentleman, I think both gentlemen, talked about that he was working in another state north of South Dakota. But his family stayed there because they got much better services here in Wyoming, and he separated from the family to go up and to provide a living.
Representative Bovee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think it'd be interesting to find out if special ed numbers are actually going up nationwide. One of the issues, I'm a retired teacher, worked with special ed. In the last few years that I was teaching, we started a program because for kids who are kindergartners that were coming in so behaviorally difficult that they just couldn't be in a regular ed classroom. And those programs are much more expensive than dealing with kids with a learning disability. And so I guess my question is then, do you feel like it feels like we're seeing more autism labels on children, more behavior, more mental health issues that I believe are more costly, and I just want you to tell me, yes, I'm right.
Yes, you're correct. I think that we can say that anecdotally, but I do think with some time we can bring some more specific data, look at national trends. We can provide that level of detail to you if given some time and that opportunity, we can and answer some of those questions to give you a comparative analysis on what the reality is. I do think we see those. I think you're seeing trends in that come up, and early intervention is key, and some of those things are a little bit more costly. We're just worried about some of the decisions that could be made by saying this type of disability is going to garner this amount of dollars, and then will you have people identifying, okay, well, I have a choice between LD and this one, but I'm going to choose the higher disability one because it attracts more dollars, or it's just not a real dollar to dollar. It's based upon the needs, not the idea eligibility category of how we fund that. So.
Okay, other questions or comments? Thank you guys very much. We really appreciate the contributions you make to education in the state. I mean, this is a big item for, and we're doing it very well. Very well. Thank you. Thank you for what you do. Other public comment?
Co-chairman, committee members, Walt Wilcox, Trona County School District, just take a few moments to answer some questions that were there in relation to Natrona, I think, which is a pretty tight representation of what's happening around the state and nationally. Numbers are up for our special ed students, about 100 students from where we were last year when we ran our counts. When we get the October deadline, we'll find we're close to 15% of our population. What Representative Bovee has mentioned is very accurate. Where we're seeing our increases over the last 5 years, primarily are what we'd call our intensive life skills students or medically fragile. They're much more on the increase. Our behavior students, which are labeled with emotional disturbance, have increased with the quantity of students we're serving. These are specialized classrooms that typically have a lower class ratio than our learning disabled type students or our learning challenge students. So they may come at a 10-to-1 ratio, for example, with lots of services that are more comprehensive for those students. So that's been a primary increase. Most of our dollars have gone to adding teacher or education support, not so much along the lines of school psychologists, social workers, occupational therapists, physical therapists, speech therapists, those areas. Those have come in low single digits, 1 to 2 as a district our size. Where we're seeing the addition would be in our learning disabled classrooms, but more of the increase towards our intensive life skills, our emotional disturbance, and our medically fragile world. We're serving more students at this point, just to give you a representation on what it's looking like within Natrona and I think around the state.
Questions or comments? Thank you. Other public testimony? Other public testimony on special education efficiencies?
Good morning. Teresa Chalk, Superintendent, Lincoln 1. I started in Lincoln 1 in 1998 as a special ed director and curriculum director, and I was a special education teacher. I'm going to start with our story on numbers, as Dan kind of alluded to. But here's an example of Lincoln 1. We have a total enrollment of 583 students today. In the span of 14 months, we had family A enroll their child with severe autism. Family B enrolled 2 children with severe autism. Family C enrolled 2 children with moderate autism. And Family D enrolled their child with severe autism. These families moved here for work or for relationship reasons. So in order to respond to these types of circumstances involving students with disabilities, the district needed the flexibility to reallocate special ed staff and add 1 new special education teaching position. One idea for staffing guidelines would be to include an application for a waiver or variance if the district can provide WDE of the need or convince them of the need. Current funding levels have put us in a position of insufficient recruitment strength for special education certified staff, as borne by the following. We currently have 2 unfilled special ed positions being staffed by long-term subs. The district has been unable to recruit a speech language pathologist for 7 years. So it's currently funding a special education teacher to earn her SLP degree and become licensed while working under the supervision of our retired speech language pathologist to meet the guidelines. And we also have not been able to recruit an OT for the past 5 years. So we do work with Region 5 BOCES, and we have OT under contract for 1 day a week to supervise an occupational therapist para. Just a point, again, that is legal, but it's not best practice. I mean, if you have a child receiving OT 3 times a week, it's better to be receiving that from the occupational therapist who's licensed than just, having somebody else provide the service, saying that I've told them what to do and it's okay. Another issue, I want to thank Matt when he talked about the difference in the increase from 14-15 to 15-16, because it did have to do with Wyoming retirement. It also had to do with the change in workers' comp. And just a personal note on that is also that was a year that we had to provide health insurance to anybody with 30 hours a week. So there were people who worked in districts that did not receive health insurance that from that point on did receive it. So you see a bump that year and the year after. A couple other statements. I was also on the APA committee for staffing guidelines for special education. We have provided that document to Shelley Hamill and Wasia. And I know that for some reason that keeps being ignored, but that work was done last year. We do have staffing guidelines that Wasia and the people in that committee were comfortable with. So I'm not sure why that's never brought forward. And the other issue I have in the presentation, I realize that this has been on the docket since 2002 to have special ed guidelines, and it's now being addressed. Don't know why it wasn't for 16 years, but we can't rush through this. I mean, this says the guidelines will be developed and effective January 1st, 2019. First and foremost, we already have people under contract till June. So at the bare minimum, it's going to have to be that this is in place and will be effective the 2019-20 school year. So anyway, I stand for questions.
Questions, comments? Thank you very much.
Mr. Chairman.
Oh, I'm sorry, Representative Freeman again.
There's been a talk of cooperation between Region 5 BOCES and Sweetwater 1 and Sweetwater 2 are thinking about being part of that. Would that be something that you'd want to be part of, or would be practical for you to join since it's only 80 miles from Green River?
We do work with Dan, and we've actually had one student that we considered taking to his day program. That student did move out. But no, yes, we're happy to do cooperating shared services to meet the needs of our students as long as it's appropriate and we don't waste a lot of windshield time. I mean, that's expensive time. Reading contracts the other day, I realized that windshield time sometimes is reduced to half price. Most of our contracts aren't that way because they don't make $200 an hour. They're making 50 to 70. But people that are contract services or 1099 employees, as you know, they make more money because they don't have any benefits. So I think it's important to weigh the cost-benefit ratio on those things. And I wanted one more point. I'm not happy with this at all, but I have 583 students today. 124 of them are on IEPs. I am at a 21.2% special ed, and the State Department does monitor that. They come in and look at our IEPs to make sure that they are appropriately identified and we're not over-identifying. Because as Representative Freeman said, they don't move here for services, but they're not the ones that leave.
Okay, thank you very much for your testimony. I'd like to recognize Representative Pat Sweeney from Casper. Pat, welcome to Joint Education. Nice to have you here. Other public testimony? Welcome.
Hi. My name is Leah Dow Sanchez, and I am an elementary teacher at Region 5 BOCES at CBARV. Senator Freeman, I just wanted to speak to your comment about, or maybe it was Mr. Coe, about people moving in for the special ed. I am new to Wyoming. I've been here for 3 years. My youngest son has ODD, sensory processing dysregulation disorder, as well as an anxiety disorder. He doesn't even receive services. We moved to Wyoming because you guys provide a better education, period. I'm a teacher from Idaho. We looked at the surrounding states 4 years ago to move anywhere besides Idaho, having lived there my whole life. And Jackson was the closest to our family in Idaho. And with a really good education, both of my boys are super excited that they participate in public education where we are. And I just wanted to point out to you that I have a kid who technically is special ed, but no longer needs services. But that's not why we moved here.
Appreciate that. Further public testimony? Any further public testimony? Okay, public testimony is closed. Okay, committee. Matt and Ted, I think we'll try to get into accountability here. I don't know how long this is going to take, but if we can get this out of the way before we go to lunch, and then we'll come back at 1:15 with our schedule.
Sure, Mr. Chairman, just my understanding is we'll work both of these bills and bring them back in November as well. Regarding the accountability, the education accountability bill, recall the advisory committee has a final report due on November 1st, so that'll, or October 1st, that'll come to you to be presented at the November meeting. So that's partially one of the reasons why the education accountability bill will be delayed until November.
Okay.
Incorporated any additional recommendations from that.
So we aren't going to do anything on them today?
Mr. Chairman, you're more than free to amend it, and we can incorporate those amendments for November. But I'll let Teddy walk the committee through the bill.
Okay.
But I just wanted to preface the conversation with that.
So let's take up 0005 first. Representative Bovee.
Mr. Chairman, before we move on, there was an offer for WCCC to be on our November agenda, and I just want to make sure we don't lose that, because I do think we should have WCCC come in November.
Mr. Chairman, we have that. We'll work with you there.
Okay. Ted, you want to start us on 0005?
And I note that, that's correct, I think we'll definitely hold over the next bill, the education accountability bill. The teacher accountability bill, I think if the committee wanted to move forward with that legislation today. So, Mr. Chairman, this bill, 1905, Working Draft 5, is largely a resurrect of the 2017 bill, House Bill 37, the engrossed version, and it amends first requirements for the state board in setting up a system for teacher evaluation. And so on page 2 of the bill, you'll see that the state board requirements to set up teacher accountability systems is amended. Under current law, the state board has to develop, by rule and regulation, a comprehensive school district teacher performance evaluation system based in part upon defined student academic performance measures, on longitudinal data systems, and measures of professional practice. Those requirements are removed, and in its place, as you'll see on page 3, the state board, in consultation with the district, has to establish criteria for district teacher performance evaluation. Additionally, the requirements for rules to be promulgated by July 1, 2019 is pushed back to July 1, 2020. That's on page 2, line 4. So, Mr. Chairman, once these rules are promulgated, then each school district has to evaluate teachers based on the criteria set by the state board. And on page 3, we get into requirements for each school district in evaluating teachers. And so, starting on line 11 on page 3, this paragraph governs evaluations for initial contract And so the contract teachers would have to be evaluated once a year under the criteria for teacher evaluation set by the state board. And it would have to be done using multiple methods and data protocols. Additionally, the evaluation might be in writing and an opportunity for feedback must be provided. On to page 4, we get into the requirement for school districts to evaluate continuing contract teachers. And the same requirements apply, except that a teacher who receives a performance rating of effective for 2 consecutive years then does not have to be evaluated every year. They would be required to be evaluated at minimum once every 3 years. Mr. Chairman, moving on, down on the bottom of page 4, we have conforming amendments. Additionally, page 5 is conforming an amendment as well. On to page 6, we get into the definition of a continuing contract teacher. And current law provides that a teacher can't become a continuing contract teacher beginning in school year 2019-2020 unless the teacher has performed satisfactorily on performance evaluation implemented by the district. And that language is removed. And so that requirement for continuing contract teachers would never come into play. Mr. Chairman, the only other real substantive change by the bill is the repealer in section 2. I'll point you to page 8. The language that would be repealed is included, and this provision provides authority to a board to suspend or dismiss any teacher based on inadequate performance through performance evaluation. So, Mr. Chairman, those are the big substantive changes by the bill.
Okay. Questions or comments? Any questions or comments? Representative Bovee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm wondering on page 4, line 12, where it says that a teacher has to be evaluated for 2 consecutive years, and then they don't have to after that. Why would we do that when continuing contract teachers, I know that if you have continuing contract and you come from someplace else, it takes 2 years, but for new teachers, it takes 3 years for them to get continuing contract. So the way I'm reading this is a new teacher comes in for 2 years, they have to be evaluated. And then if there is satisfactory for those 2 years, they wouldn't have to be evaluated as often, but yet they haven't received continuing contract. I'm a little unclear on that.
Mr. Chairman, I think this, the provision you point out on page 4 can apply to continuing contract teachers, because if a teacher isn't evaluated performing effectively for 3 or 4 years, and they still become a continuing contract teacher, then they could, at that point, perform effectively for 2 years, and then they would only be required to be evaluated once every 4 years. It may not make perfect sense to do it that way. I'm not sure exactly why. I think the House in 2017 amended this in. I wasn't there for that discussion. I'm not sure if the continuing contract teacher requirements and this were designed to be synced up or not. But that's the best I've got for you. I imagine that other folks might have an opinion on the matter.
Mr. Chairman.
Representative Freeman.
And this is probably for Ted. It's on. Aren't all teachers required to be evaluated once a year under current statute?
Correct, Mr. Chairman. The stricken language on page 3 for initial contract teachers. Talked about not the stricken language. Down on lines 20 and 21, on page 3, the teacher shall receive a copy of each evaluation of its performance. And on page 4, Mr. Chairman, Representative Freeman, I'm sure you're right. I just don't remember exactly where that requirement is.
Well, I might say on page 4, line 2, it says establish a teacher performance evaluation system and require the performance of each continuing contract teacher to be evaluated. So I think that implies that it has to happen every year, but I could be wrong.
Oh, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Ellis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just one clarifying question. So on page 2, we're saying that the board shall promulgate rules and regulations, and is that subject to APA, Wyoming Administrative Procedures Act?
Further discussion or comments? Ted, anything else?
Mr. Chairman, I apologize. Senator Ellis, did you ask if the rules and regs are subject to the APA?
Yes, I just want to make sure I'm understanding that correctly.
Yes, that would be subject to the APA. This is the state board promulgating these rules. Rules developed through the state board are subject to the Administrative Procedures Act. They are.
So this is the bill we passed it last year, and then Dicky hijacked it with that one amendment. That's why it failed dissent.
Failed dissent?
Yeah, that was the whole reason. So we were passing it last year.
So this is the bill that we passed last year?
Yeah, right up until that moment when he added the change on what you can fire a teacher for. I think that's good. And then it went to Congress and died. So it's not an evil bill, I don't think. I think we were through.
I think we should take some public comment on what we got.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think we'll do that before we go to the next bill. I'll be candid and honest with everybody in the room. I don't like this bill, but public comment on it. I think we'll take public comment, and then we'll go to the next bill. Public comment on 0005. Brian Farmer.
Mr. Chairman, Brian Farmer, Wyoming School Boards Association. I would say that this is something that we're supportive of primarily for the language stricken on page 2. On page 2, if nothing else changes, there are significant requirements that will go into place next year that are not presently in place. Chapter 29 has to be changed for teacher evaluation to meet this kind of big, long laundry list of requirements. That used to be required for No Child Left Behind, for waivers, for Race to the Top. That's kind of the reason that stuff got into the WAEA. So this is kind of eliminating some of those new requirements that go into effect next year. I certainly agree that some of the additional language, the red language in the bill, could be better at times. I don't have specific suggestions, but that stuff on page 2 is pretty important to scratch out from our perspective.
No, go ahead.
No, Senator Roberts.
No, we'll wait.
Further public comment on 0005.
Co-chairman and committee members, Walt Wilcox, now serving in the State Board of Education chairman role. Would like to have the discussion with you. State Board had the opportunity over their meeting in Afton last week to go over this bill and just provide some input for some of the concerns as State Board of Education as this relates, or at least awareness. One of the things that we'd point out after looking through this legislation, proposed legislation, is the the need to try to place some consistency in terminology. Throughout the document, it's referenced several times, beginning on pages 4 and 5, with the terms of ineffective or effective and unsatisfactory or maybe unsatisfactory. And so just that terminology of consistency is something we'd ask for, that throughout the document, it does create a little bit of confusion on which area, or are there multiple areas to be looked at. Another side that was discussed at the State Board of Education meeting with the committee was the example. We've had some districts that have talked with us about what the potential or possibility would be for schools or districts that are meeting or exceeding on accountability to provide them more flexibility related to this expectation for teacher accountability. So we just bring that forward as something to consider. We believe the rest of it could be handled in rules as it comes out, with the flexibility for where the standards and how districts would align to that. And then last but not least, we're looking for some direction, but believe that within the rule set, the requirements for teacher performance levels and the reporting on that would come under the rule set, but did not know if there need to be more definition on what those requirements were for reporting teacher performance levels within that legislation. So stand for questions, but just some input from the State Board of Education towards this topic.
Questions, comments? Thank you very much. Other public testimony? Any other public testimony? Other public testimony? Seeing none? Public testimony is closed. Okay. We'll go to the next bill, which is 006, Education Accountability. Ted, Matt.
Mr. Chairman, so this is a bill that's product of myself working with Dr. Dicky at the Department of Education. It represents the recommendations of the Advisory Committee and the Department of Education to update the Wyoming Accountability and Educational Practices. And the first real substantive requirement imposed by the bill.
Thank you.
Starts at the bottom of page 2. Amendments above that are really just clarifying amendments. At the bottom of page 2, you'll see that within the informal review process conducted by the State Board, and a school requests review of its overall performance rating or a other performance rating, the informal review process to only examine whether the department properly considered and reported the school's overall performance rating or other performance determinations. This new language provides that the review process conducted by the State Board can't result just in an end run around the accountability system. The components of the accountability system can't be changed based on that process. Mr. Chairman, on page 3, subsection E, starting on line 8, governs the establishment of performance targets for Wyoming schools for indicators in the accountability system, both for alternative schools and traditional schools. And this removes a reference to a 2012 accountability report. Currently, the performance targets have to conform to that report. That's removed, and instead the State Board shall establish appropriate and rigorous performance targets. Additionally, the indicators, performance targets may be developed in consultation with one or more advisory committees of education stakeholders assembled by the superintendent. And the reason for that language, as I understand it, is the advisory committee on education accountability is being phased out at the end of this year. So this language would authorize the State Board and superintendent to use an advisory committee if they so choose to set these performance. Mr. Chairman, on page 4, subsection F makes similar changes to target levels for overall school performance ratings and indicator level performance. So the 2012 report reference is removed. The target levels have to be appropriate and rigorous as established by the State Board. Again, an advisory committee established by the state superintendent and help in this process. And under current law, when the target levels are set, a professional judgment panel must be used to inform that process. This makes that optional. The state board can use a professional judgment panel if it's so. Additionally, you'll notice on lines 6 through 9 the stricken language there, and that eliminates one of the reasons that the state board to reset target level. So it would remove the requirement that the state board reset the target level based on a periodic review of the accountability system. Mr. Chairman, moving on to page 5, subsection H of the Wyoming Accountability Education Act gets into statewide system of support and intervention. And once again, we're removing the reference to the 2012 report. The systems of support and intervention for alternative schools and traditional schools would have to meet the goals that are included on lines 12 through 19. So the systems shall provide support for low-performing students, establish support and mentoring for teachers and school leaders in need improvement, increase the ability of schools and school districts to improve achievement and growth indicator performance, expand the ability for schools and school districts within the state to continuously improve and provide for coordination with institutions that improve success. Mr. Chairman, moving on to page 6. This governs when the state board needs to report to this committee on the accountability system. And currently, the requirement is to do that of September 1 of every year. The language added on lines 14 through 17 provides that the report can be made on November 1 in years in which there is a significant change to the statewide assessment or the statewide accountability. And then, Mr. Chairman, page 7, we just have one cleanup amendment at the top. Page 8 has a forming amendment. Page 9 has some clarifying language that doesn't change any substantive requirements of the law. And then on page 10, the repealer removes the reference to the 2012 Education Accountability Report. That's eliminated from law entirely. Then, Mr. Chairman, on page 11, and this is not a recommendation of the advisory committee or Department of Education, but I believe is a requirement of the law. This section would require the State Board of Education to establish the accountability system in a rule. And the location for the statutory requirement to do that is on page 9. And that's within the State Board of Education requirement. And on page 9, starting on line 8, it says, subject to in accordance with 21.204, through the state superintendent in consultation and coordination with local school districts, by rule and regulation, implement a statewide accountability system. So I read that as requiring the state board to put the accountability system into rule. And as I understand it, the accountability system is not in rule. There are various handbooks that are used to govern the accountability system. And so section 3 would require the State Board of Education by July 1, 2020 to promulgate rules to implement the statewide accountability system. That one has the advantage of complying with statute, but also makes a bit more permanent accountability system. Changes to the accountability system would have to go through the rulemaking process. There would be notice, opportunity for comment. And so don't blame WDE or the advisory committee for that change. That's LSO's recommendation on that. And Mr. Chairman, that's a sort of brief summary of the bill. I'd be happy to take any questions.
Questions or comments of staff on 0006? Any discussion from the committee? Okay, we will take public comment on 0006. Welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. Tom Saxey, coordinator for the State Board of Education. This is Walt Wilcox, our chairman. We really appreciate the Legislative Service Office working on 0006. There's some clarification in terms of terminology and dates that the State Board genuinely appreciates. A few observations for your consideration. First is on Romanet 6, on the bottom of page 2 and the beginning of page 3, the State Board is constrained to conduct its informal review process under Chapter 3 only to issues where the Wyoming Department of Education has created a calculation problem. That's quite restrained, and that's all right if that's the mood of the committee. The State Board wanted to have you at least think through the possibility of schools or school districts coming to the State Board with an anomalous event. Spring flood happens and the kids can't take white top in their own school. A bad cough goes through the whole system and half the kids either don't take or do poorly on the AC. Those kind of anomalous results can occur. The State Board has no interest in doing an end run around the model. The State Board very much supports the model of the accountability system as it now plays off. But there are situations where a school may be rated more poorly just to some random events. And we think that the State Board would be a willing advocate to go to bat for some of these schools to see whether there's some accommodations that might be made in terms of their school performance rating. A second point that the State Board made in discussing this last week was on Section F, page 5, in which the superintendent selects committees, much like the Advisory Committee on Accountability and the Technical Advisory Group. The State Board feels like the superintendent should include at least one other member of the State Board. Remember, of course, our state superintendent is ex officio on the State Board, but the State Board would like to have one other State Board member in each of those committees going forward. And then finally, the State Board would like to have a little bit better consistency in terms of some of the language. In particular, the State Board is responsible for establishing the state system of support. Does that mean they approve the state system of support? Do they evaluate it and report back to this committee? The State Board would like a little bit of clarification on that. And with that, we stand for comments.
Thank you very much. Any questions or comments?
Mr. Chairman?
Senator Rothfuss.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was trying to figure out, you mentioned the desire to have a member of the board on the advisory committees. Is that bottom of page 4 onto page 5? Did you have any suggested language or any thoughts on how that would be implemented? I think that's what we're talking about.
Yes. Following the line, the superintendent on the top of page 5, we could add a line that would say, including at least one other member of the Wyoming State Board of Education.
Okay, thank you.
Would staff make note of that? We can, when we work the bill in November, we can maybe have that amendment.
Mr. Chairman, we're more than happy to work with the chairman in the time between.
Okay. Okay. Thank you very much. Other public comment on 0006. Any other comment? Any other public comment? Okay, public comments closed. Staff, I think we'll break for lunch and come back. Senator Rothfuss.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think we're going to switch topics after lunch. Is that right? So,
pardon?
Would comment on accountability be appropriate now instead of after lunch, or would you rather do that after lunch? 005. I was going to talk about 005 just for a moment.
Why don't we do it right after lunch?
Right after lunch. Done.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
We only have one agenda item left, and it's a major one. But if we're going to get out of here at a decent time, so let's go ahead and
no worries.
Break for lunch right now. We'll come back. We'll come back in at 1:15.